Okay, it's 9 o'clock. I'll get started. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you're new to these spaces, what we do here is we cover the news, but I try to heavily accent it with open source information, usually that's drawn from great accounts here on Twitter. And in addition to covering the news, we try to present tools and techniques. So whether you're new to open source work or you've been at it a while, hopefully we create opportunities for everybody to bring their skills up. And we will often have guests on to present projects that they're working on. The goal there is if you find a project interesting, then hopefully we'll create opportunities for collaboration and build the community out in that way. We don't have a guest with us tonight, but because of the events of the last 2 days, we have plenty of material. Often we don't wind up getting through all the material. That's probably going to be the case again tonight, but we'll make a good go of it. We do have an interesting guest lined up for our discussion on Sunday afternoon, Ryan Hendrickson, who goes by the handle Tip of the Spear here on Twitter. And he's going to chat with us about the demining efforts of his team. So it should be a really interesting conversation. This space relies heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where links to individual tweets are posted. The reason I rely so much on the nest is because I try to bring all of my sources. So if you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, you'll find that first tweet is the invitation to tonight's space. But if you were to click through it, in the thread below, you'll see it's my agenda, my speaking notes. And I try to include sources for everything that I'll speak to. That way, you don't have to take my word for very much at all. And if any of it catches your interest, then you have it to take away as a starting point for further reading. What that also allows you to do is to look ahead at the subjects that we want to cover. And if any of them catch your interest and you have questions or comments, when we come to that part of the discussion, please request the microphone. We'll bring you up and we'll try and work you into the conversation. You can do that by hitting the mic button, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. We would love to have as many people as possible join the conversation. So if you're enjoying it as we go along, please consider retweeting it. You can do that with the button that's in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. So in terms of timing, I like to present some resources up front. That allows the crowd to build up a little bit. It also allows people who are maybe more interested in tools and so on to know we'll cover those at the top of the space. That will probably take about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll get into updates. I'll begin with what's in the nest now. I'm starting at the far right-hand side, and that first item on the right, once again, is the invitation to tonight's space. The second from the right is the invitation to our conversation on Sunday afternoon. I host these talks twice a week, Thursday nights at 9 p.m. and Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And so you can set your reminder now. Honestly, I think that conversation with Ryan will be really interesting because we have occasionally touched on the idea of demining and how to get additional demining data. Given the challenges that mines present at the front line, he'll probably have some great insights. The third item from the right is a reminder that friends of ours live stream this conversation to YouTube. I'd always encourage you to participate here on Twitter because that's how you can contribute to the conversation. But if you just want to listen, whether because you've missed an episode or it's just more convenient that way, head over to that channel and you can catch the live stream and also look up previous conversations. The item in the middle of the nest at the moment is our calendar and a couple of events. If you were to click through to that, the link there to team up, it opens a calendar in your browser. And we created this because the search function in Twitter Spaces is not very good, and we have a few friends who host spaces, and we didn't want to be overlapping one another, like our friends at Touchney, for example. And we thought if we had a calendar going, we would add external events to it. We're sort of in the doldrums of summer, so there aren't a ton of events, but it does seem like there have been more invitations or in the last week or so as people are ramping up. So hopefully we'll get more items there. If you come across any events that you think would be interesting to the community, please send them to myself or to my co-host, Planet Baroque, and we'll make sure we get them in the calendar. I won't break them out individually into the nest, but if you do have a look at that item, which is in the middle, so fourth from the right or the left, there are 3 events I've included just to note today. The first is that there is an essay contest put on by RURSI, the Royal United Services Institute. It might not apply to a lot of you because you have to be a full-time student, but I believe that includes graduate students. And it's an essay contest writing about national or international defense and security. And so if you head over to their website, you'll get a sense of the rules and, a little bit more on the themes they'd like you to be writing on. And it looks like a great opportunity for a student. There's a prize of £1,000. There's also a conference coming up. I don't know a lot about it, but it's from an account that I follow and is very thoughtful. It is the Countering Subversive Strategic Competition Conference. And it's being put on by the College of Information and Cyberspace at National Defense University in the US. And I believe it's being held September the 18th. And so it sounds like if you're in that field, and maybe you didn't know about it, that signups are still open. Finally, in terms of events, there is a tweet there from DFR Lab, which is the Digital Forensics Lab of the Atlantic Council. And they have a program on that they call Digital Sherlocks. And it's a free program to learn the basics of some digital investigation techniques. And there is a deadline, September the 5th. So that's just under 2 weeks left to sign up. I just signed up this afternoon, so I don't know very much about what's contained in the program. But I when I find these that are free, I often like to sign up just to learn the material. And the DFR Lab is quite well known, so you might enjoy that. Moving along to podcasts. So I'm working now from the second and third items from the left in the nest. And again, I won't break these out. There were quite a few. And so this first set, working from the third item from the left, there were a few podcasts that were incredibly diligent, and they put out episodes on really short notice about the events surrounding the crash of Prigozhin's airplane. And so in there, you'll see there are episodes of podcasts from the BBC Ukraine cast. There is also a podcast episode that was quickly put out by NPR, and they spoke with Sean McFate, who is a professor of strategy at Georgetown, about how Putin is rather like the Bond villain, and this really exemplifies that. And I, as a Bond, I can confirm that Putin is a Bond villain. And then as a third quick podcast on this, there was a new episode of Geopolitics Decanted that was put out, which is produced by Dmitry Alperovich. And he spoke with some familiar names to our crowd, including Rob Lee and Jack Margolin. So Rob covers, he's an academic of war, and he covers events in Ukraine in huge detail. And Jack Margolin is focused on private military companies and has followed Wagner for 5 or 6 years in detail. So that looks like a great episode. And then last in this tweet, that's third from the left, is in fact, there was a second episode of Geopolitics Decanted this week. And so the regularly scheduled episode, they spoke with, what's the gentleman's name? The host of the Risky Business podcast came on to work with them. And they spoke with Ilya Vityuk, who is one of the heads of the Russian cyber ops units, about their efforts to counter Russian cyber attack. So, again, probably fascinating to a large number of our listeners. Anyway, so Geopolitics Decanted was busy this week, putting out 2 episodes. The second item from the left, a couple more podcasts, going through them quickly. There was one put out by Bloomberg in their episode of The Big Take, looking at whether how the U.S. is dependent on Russian uranium and whether the U.S. can build up its own capacity to produce nuclear fuel. And I know that this is an interesting topic for some allies as well. I understand there have been discussions for Westinghouse to produce uranium fuel for sale to several Eastern European allies, and I believe including potentially Ukraine. So there may be details in that talk. There was a new episode of War on the Rocks. It was hosted by Michael Kaufman, and he spoke with Nicholas Danforth, who's a professor of strategy, I believe, just about in general an update on the Ukraine summer offensive. And Michael Kaufman is a great analyst, great commentator. So I'm sure that's a fascinating conversation. There was a podcast put out by the ICRC Law and Policy Center on what does it mean to be a humanitarian in the course of a war. And we try to mix in a variety of, not just purely military, but also humanitarian, diplomatic, and the like. So the ICRC talk may interest you. Two last ones. The second from the bottom is actually a link. It'll link out to a YouTube video. But it's Good Times, Bad Times is a channel on YouTube that I followed for a long time, since before the full-scale invasion. And this channel works closely with Konrad Muzyka, who's one of the better analysts when it comes to the military matters in Belarus and that region. So they sort of map out and visualize a lot of the analysis that he comes to. So it should be a great episode. I think this is now the third or fourth they've produced based on his content. And then finally, there was a podcast put out with Vox. They have a talk called Today Explained, and they spoke with Dr. Jade McGlynn, who specializes in Russian politics and history. And she works with the Institute for the Study of War, I believe. With the Department of War Studies at King's College London. So I have often seen her. I think she just has a book out as well, if I'm not mistaken. I don't recall the title, but should be a great talk. Anyway, hopefully some of those catch your attention. I know a lot of friends of mine that I speak to will listen to these various podcasts, when they're in the car, driving along, so on. I'll take maybe 5 more minutes. I wanted to speak to some interesting resources and just a handful of examples. So I'll put these up as a block in the front of the nest. So it should appear as the first item up there in just a moment. And so I'll speak to these while it's waiting to load. The first is that Konrad Muzyka, who I just mentioned in connection with the Good Times, Bad Times YouTube video. So he has his own website where he publishes his analysis. And most of his products are, subject to a subscription fee. He's released a new set of analysis focused on Kaliningrad, I guess as an underserved area. And he's decided that the first 4 installments of that newsletter will be free. And so this is a link to the second of the 4 newsletters that he's just put out on Kaliningrad. There was an interesting, sorry, I'm just going to pause to make sure it actually wound up in the nest so you guys can be following along. Oh, it has, great. Okay. The second is a tweet from the head of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but, just passing along a new article that is on commercial data brokers and the extent of their power. And so there are huge aspects that are traditionally in the OSINT field. We tend to be focused more on the military, but there are significant personal security, cybersecurity aspects that we touch on less frequently. But I am interested in the policy implications, to personal information and both how to protect yourself, but also occasionally you'll hear in research that folks are doing that they're going out and furthering their investigation by purchasing data in the open market. And for example, Bellingcat has spoken about purchasing phone records from Russia in several instances. And so while those would be sort of in the black market that they're referring to, there are, burgeoning significant open markets where this data is, collected under terms of service and consolidated and then sold around. They're moving down in that tweet on resources. There are 2 talks coming up in the next few days, both being put on by Bellingcat. The first of which discusses how to navigate through the Open Corporates database. And so if you're doing, companies analysis, whether you're investigating sanctions or matters, or, for example, the folks who track Wagner, would track their activity. There were posts just in the last few weeks about, as Wagner moved to Belarus, they were tracking how there was a Concord corporation set up, to mimic the Concord catering group, and then there was separately a Wagner entity set up in Belarus as well. And so the ability to track the activity of parties you're having a look at the corporate level can be important. The second of the Bellingcat talks coming up is how to monitor live video feeds for the purposes of OSINT research. And it also walks through some interesting tools. And so these talks, I believe they're both going to be held on Bellingcat's Discord server. And so that post about the monitoring live feeds includes a link to their Discord. So I joined, months ago, but you might find it interesting. In this block, the last item is an update from our friends at GeoConfirmed. And they're just doing a quick walkthrough in a tweet format of their website, because they've changed the functionality, they've improved some things. And then if you're interested in seeing how these sorts of efforts are organized, you can see that if you scroll all the way down in the thread, toward the bottom, they have a table that highlights their plan for future development. And so I always like to get that kind of insight into where these groups are headed. And obviously GeoConfirmed does a terrific job. Couple more resources for about 2-3 more minutes, then we'll move into our updates. So it should populate in the front of the nest in just a moment. The first tweet in this new block, so most of these are tools, so I can go through them fairly quickly. The first tweet is from Cyber Detective, who puts out daily updates on tools. There was one that was actually helpful in our analysis of the Prigozhin plane crash, because there were several videos that came out. I don't know if you've ever tried to do analysis of them, and you try to hit that perfect moment where you have the right background and you want to freeze it for geolocation purposes, or an image is blurred, like a falling airplane is spinning. Well, this tool, it's links, I think, to several tools where you can take a video, upload it to the service, and then they'll give you back a series of static images. And so I tested it out for the first time, and they work pretty well. So that's a tool I'm going to use in the future. The second item there is a walkthrough, a quick tutorial on how some US agencies go through the process of trying to identify if an image is fake. And we've talked about, AI generated images. And I think in the past I've also presented some toolkits for software tools that try to, apply filters to identify fake images. But here's a tutorial walkthrough. The third item down in resources is from, what's the name of the project again? Just bear with me. I believe it's called Hunchly. And this is an organization that has been crawling the dark web using, I believe, the Tor browser for several years in order to grab links and references and so on. So the idea is to take some of the dark web off the dark web, so that if you want to be doing, link analysis or, relationship analysis using some of these networks, they have this huge database for it. So that caught my eye. It's not something I work in personally, but I'm sure it can be helpful to some of you. Fourth item down is a tweet from Clandestine, and he often will tweet out about OSINT tools. In the past, we've talked about this platform called start.me, and it's where you can put together your own dashboard to link into lots of different tools. And I guess a friend or somebody known to Clandestine has put together this dashboard of more than 500 OSINT tools. Of course, I haven't looked at the 500 tools completely. There are some obvious ones in there, but hearing that it's so comprehensive, I'm sure that it can inspire you. And if nothing else, even if you don't use very many of these tools, it might inspire you to put together your own start.me dashboard with just a handful of these as a starting point. Finally, and this is, occasionally I like to toss in a bit of a joke or a post on OSINT philosophy. Here, I'll break this one out to the front of the nest. This is H.I. Sutton, who is Covert Shores here on Twitter, just talking about the application of the Dunning-Kruger effect to OSINT on Twitter. And that idea of when you start with a little bit of knowledge, you can be very confident because you don't know what you don't know. There's usually a rapid drop-off in confidence as you start to realize how much you're missing. And only after lots and lots of experience gaining knowledge do you slowly come back up that confidence curve again. And I partly put this in here just as an excuse to caution and say, guys, beware the sources that you're looking to. They are not all created equal here on Twitter. And this is partly why I try to source all the items that I speak to, is so that you're not just relying on me, but you can go and look at who I'm drawing my inspiration from. Okay, I'll just take one more moment to see if there's anything else I want to mention, then I'll move on to updates, I think. Here, one more thing I'll put up quickly is a block of some interesting examples from the last week. It should be in the front of the nest in just a moment. Very quickly, because we focus so much on Ukraine, I do like to get in a few non-Ukraine examples, just to identify accounts to follow, or if you're more into technical matters, you can follow those developments. And so let me see if it's populated. Yes, it has. So the first item there is talking about, it links through to a story about the use of drones by Mexican cartels now flying Chinese drones in order to drop bombs. And it's spread, and there was some great contribution into that article. And, further analysis by the accounts identified there, right? Louis, Wasso BB, All Source News. All Source, of course, is a friend of ours who has come to speak with us about his coverage of cartels before. So I just want to highlight that as that link to Ukraine, and also those are some great accounts to follow if you're interested in developments in Latin America. The second item down, we lately have been speaking a little bit more about satellite technology, and it was just announced by Joe Morrison? Sorry. Yep, Joe Morrison of Umbra. They're doing a lot of innovative things with their satellite imagery. They were talking about photogrammetry last week. This week, it turns out they had won an award from the Air Force in order to try to prove that they can generate short videos that will identify moving objects, presumably vehicles and the like, using their several second exposure satellite images. So that's looks like it's going to be a novel application. There was some good OSINT work done by, I believe it's Human Rights Watch. So it's the third item down there. It's the tweet by Joey Shea. They had a look at reports of violence along the Yemen-Saudi border, in particular migrants, many of them from Sudan, fleeing the fighting there, and how there appears to be sort of indiscriminate violence by Saudi border guards. And so efforts to document those sorts of things are an important sort of application of some of the tools we discuss. Two last items, maybe a little bit philosophical. There was a tweet by Rob Lee where he was praising Dan Spion So Dan does a variety of OSINT work, including working with orcs on his losses tracking project. And Dan has created several threads that track events in specific battles, and he's been updating many of those for months. And it was raised because Dan had noted that he now gets firsthand reports from people on the ground because he's been at it so long. He's built a good reputation. And Rob was just highlighting how important these threads are, and that led to quite a long discussion in the replies where I had said, yeah, I don't think people appreciate how important these will be for research. And then it got into a discussion about, backing up data and reliance on Twitter for storing these sorts of things. So there was a bit of an interesting back and forth there. And then finally, as in what I think is a good example, is another tweet from H.I. Sutton. He earlier in the week had taken a tweet by a lesser known account, sort of a news account out of China, and said it may be possible that there has been a Chinese submarine that has had some kind of an emergency, possibly in the Taiwan Strait. And so he put that out and had said, it's unconfirmed, it's very tentative, and that his popularization of it and others led a bunch of people to go and look at it. And I'm only mentioning this because friends of mine who try to do, satellite analysis, they look at shipping info, they look at radio signals and so on, spent a while trying to find out if there were any corroboration to this story, and they couldn't find anything. And I wanted to point it out because H.I. Sutton came back and said, look, I deleted this because I've looked and I can't find any evidence. And I want to highlight the importance of, sort of like in other academic pursuits, if you have a non-result, it can be worth reporting that, if only to wave off others from wasting their time trying to track it down themselves, and also so that sort of these threads don't exist hanging open forever. So if you raise a question and you solve it yourself, or if you raise a question and you think, oh, it has turned into nothing, go back and update people, because there may be people who don't speak to you, but who are following along with you. So I think that can be important. Okay, I'm going to move into updates. So what we're going to do, I wasn't sure when my co-host Radio and Nukes was going to be able to join, but it's terrific that he's here now, because I know that he wanted to speak about some of the efforts that he was involved in, including looking at the crash of Prigozhin's airplane. So what I'm actually going to do is start with that material. And so if you wanted to follow along, you have to scroll down to the bottom of the agenda thread, and there's a part 2 continuation. By the way, I do that because Twitter used to allow you to post, I think, 25 posts. And then you could, add in that same inline thread another 25 posts in a block. But now the way it works is you can post 25, and after that you can only add them one at a time. And rather than hit my followers with tons and tons of posts, I do one big thread and then a second thread for the leftovers, and then I combine them together. But in any event, I'm going to put these materials up, so if you'll just bear with me, please. I'm going to start with some of the fundamentals with regard to the crash, the things that we actually know, including some of the geolocations. So one more item. So these should show up in the front of the nest in just a moment. The first of which will be a tweet from Ian Garner. And I've put this up as a bit of a joke, but it's the idea of here's what we actually know about the crash. And what Dr. Garner's written there is that so far we know that Prigozhin's plane was shot down by a missile, destroyed by a bomb, and downed by mechanical failure. We know that Putin did it, Ukraine did it, and that it was an accident. We also know that Putin has emerged stronger and weaker, and that also Ukraine is in a better and a worse position. And I know that's a bit of an overstatement, a bit of a joke, but the reason I put it that way is because there are, very few of the possibilities have been definitively ruled out. And I just want to highlight that there's still a lot we don't know. And so we'll explore a couple of the alternatives. Some are obviously way more likely than others, but I still like to walk through them. So the second item in the nest is the satellite imagery that came out this morning of the location of the crash. And if you scroll down in Brady Afric's thread, in his second post, he includes the latitude and longitude there. So if you wanted to look up the location for yourself, you'll be able to do that. And this is all just so that there's independent verification of the things that we're getting ground photographs of, and it establishes, location, likely time frames. It matches up with flight tracks, all of those sorts of things, just to double check things. And so this wreckage is the fuselage and the majority of the body of the plane. However, it's reported, and it appears, that the plane broke into several sections, and that separately its tail section landed in one other location, and one of its wings landed in a third location. So if you scroll to the third item in the nest, you'll see that's the geolocation of the tail section, and it includes lat and long in there. And you'll see in the image what he's done is highlighted some key parts, like the break in the tree line where the road enters a little section of tall grass. There's a fairly distinctive wall, and then again, you can match up the color of the roof line and the positioning of the two roofs in the photographs. And so these photographs were from the ground were pulled from Telegram. I have the links to that if you guys needed that stuff. But matching up those photographs with, essentially to geolocate it, they go into Google Earth or a similar product, and will, based on the known flight path, and they knew where the fuselage landed, they can have a sense of, well, the tail probably fell roughly along the same line. It probably fell first because it had less momentum to it. And that's exactly what you find. So we now know where the fuselage and the tail were. We haven't identified the landing spot of the wing. So if anybody I heard one report that it may have landed near a small river or stream that's nearby. Now I know where the stream is. I just don't know specifically where the wing would have landed. If anybody has seen any pictures on Telegram of that wing section, or claims of locations, please pass them along to me, and I'll pass them along to others who are looking at it. The fourth item back is just to highlight how good, in my opinion, flight radar has been through this process. And so this is just one post they put up, but they put out 4 or 5 in connection with the crash of Prigozhin's plane, including their flight track. They put out a tweet showing the gradual altitude climb. What this graph is the rate of climb, and you can see how right at the end it becomes, extremely negative. So there was no gradual coasting, which you can look at things like, if there were a mechanical problem, it's unlikely that would be particularly catastrophic or necessarily happen quickly. So you might expect there to be more time either to put out a message or to attempt to change altitude. So the data put out by flight radar can narrow down possibility sets. And then just this morning, or around noon Eastern time, I think flight radar actually put out a full set with all the data points that they had received in connection with the flight. So nukes, am I right? I think I heard friends of ours discussing, saying it was something like 30,000 entries in that data set.
Yeah, let me look here. Yeah, it was 34,002. So yeah, it was quite the data set.
Not sure Nukes is there with us. Oh.
Did you hear me okay, or are you not hearing me?
Yes, he is. He's just maybe a tad quieter than your voice, but he is there.
Okay. Anyway, I'm not hearing Nukes. Is it just me, or Planet? Are you hearing him?
I can hear him. Can you hear me?
Okay, it may be an issue for me. So what I'm going to do is the very next item is actually the thread that Nukes put together. So I'm going to turn it over to Nukes to walk through what data he's included in his thread, and I'll rejoin, and hopefully I'll have my audio back. So I'll see you in a minute.
All right, first off, can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can everybody else give a little thumbs up or something to indicate?
All right, looks like they're hearing me. So first off, I want to say that I'm going to go through a lot of air defense stuff here, and like we said at the beginning, this was just something to make sure that we had no way to rule this out. So at this time, we don't have any more information, but we can't rule out the air defense being a possibility. So if you pull the tweet up in the nest, it has the map with the different colored range rings and things on it. I'll kind of go through that to start out with. So the plane was, leaving Moscow, heading northwest towards presumably St. Petersburg. Flight radar was using something called MLAT, or multilateration, to track the plane, and that is where a lot of times if you look at flight radar, you'll get ADS-B data, and that's where the plane actually sends its GPS coordinates out over a radio system, and it's picked up and you know exactly where the plane is. In this case, they were doing something called MLAT, and that's where there are multiple receivers on the ground. It's very similar to triangulation, but the multilateration is it can be more than three, so it could be hundreds of receivers or just three, and they use the time that signal leaves the plane until it gets to the Flight Radar 24 receiver, which is a crowdsourced platform. So they're mostly Raspberry Pis with a little USB stick connected to them. And in that area, the MLAT coverage is pretty poor. So that's why we didn't have a track of this flight from takeoff to the time that it crashed, or whatever happened, whatever the incident was caused from. However, the data that comes out of the plane they call it Mode S IFF, which is a system of sending out data over the same radio link that you would send out the ADS-B. It just doesn't include the ADS-B data. So it does include some information, heading, altitude, the call sign in certain data types, and indicated airspeed and so on. And Flight Radar 24 did release that data, and that was the file that they released. It had 34,002 rows in this CSV file, so it's a large file. And they did track the plane up until right image here, until 15/20/14 UTC. That was the last Mode S data. So that's basically all we have from Flight Radar 24. We've got a short track, and then we've got another roughly it'd be 11 minutes or give or take of Mode S data that does not contain a position. And that's not uncommon in that area. I went back and looked to make sure that we weren't dealing with some kind of jamming or EW that caused this to happen, and that doesn't appear to be the case. Several flights at that same rough altitude seem to lose MLAT tracks in that same area, so it's just a coverage issue, having multiple receivers hearing the same plane. So after that, I started looking at the air defense assets in the region, and really 4 sites stood out. And let's start with the radar sites first. So we had the 2260th Separate Radio Technical Battalion north of the crash site, the 2268th just to the southeast, being the closest radar site, and probably most notably for radar sites, the 337th Radio Technical Regiment. And that site actually contains the full NEBO-M or Sky-M system, which is a highly capable system, and there's also what they call a Gamma S radar there, which is a fairly rare thing. We don't see those very often at those sites. So that combined with what they call a Casta 2.2, which is a been a very effective low altitude detection radar system, but it can also do high altitude detection. So the plane basically went right over that site, and it would have been well tracked on radar from all three of these sites without issue at that flight altitude. Moving on from that, we started to look for air defense sites capable of launching missiles. And as far as fixed sites go, of course, there could be mobile assets anywhere in here that we are not seeing. But the 42nd Guards Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment headquarters, which is located about 68 kilometers northwest of the site, does contain several S-300/400 TELs. It's very hard to tell from satellite image exactly what the system is, because S-300 PMU or PM in Russia's case is very similar to S-400. But that site also contained what they call the 92N6 radar, which is the engagement radar. And that is what actually guides the missile to a target. So I did the plot using Cambridge Pixel. And if you look in the left kind of middle image underneath my logo there, the 42nd Guards S-300 PM radar coverage, the plane was well within range of that 92N6 radar. Of note, the 92N6 radar was up on a tall mast to get it above the tree line, which is pretty common in the forest of Russia. We see that pretty often. Those masts can be either 30 or 40 meters tall, which gives them unobstructed line of sight to guide these missiles. And again, the plane was well within the radar coverage and also well within the range of the 48N6, which is the most common missile that you'd find, and that's what those TELs appear to be in the satellite image, which a TEL is a transporter erector launcher. So I guess TLDR on this, the plane was well covered by air defense. So we can't really rule an S-300/400 missile out at this time, at least by just technical analysis of its location and where it was in line of sight. I think beyond that, we don't really have a lot more at this point. Just to be full disclosure, pretty much anywhere in European Russia, if you were at 28,000 feet in an aircraft, you would be within air defense range, and most likely an S-300/400 system. They have them all over the place, especially around Moscow and closer to the NATO border. So this is not an uncommon thing. It's not there's nothing unusual about these sites. They are literally just dot the entire landscape of European Russia. So I think that's most of the quick analysis on this. We did find, thanks to Brady Afric, I went ahead and bought the same image just so that I had access to it to put it on here. But we've got the crash site, and then later the tail debris was geolocated, which is on the side there, which it's about 2.5 kilometers from the crash site, which seems to be very consistent with the flight path. Somewhere in there, it appears there might have been a slight turn, but it could also be bad MLAT data. The plane was heading at like 306 degrees, and it appears that in order to get from that last point to where the crash site is, it's about 323, but that could also just be how it came out of the sky, or maybe there was a slight turn in there because we don't have the flight plan. I think that's about all I've got.
Well, thanks for that, Nukes. That was, it was an interesting process to work through some of those details and assisting us in those details. So I wanted to start with the geolocations and what was known about, the flight path and the air defense sites. This next block, and again, if any of this inspires you, Nukes, feel free to weigh in. I wanted to look at some of the video evidence that is out there. So if you have a look at the front of the nest, that first item is one of the best videos that was taken. So there were 2 or 3 that caught Prigozhin's plane as it was falling. But this one seems to catch the incident at the earliest point of the available videos. And you'll see I chose this one because this one has marked up the image a little bit. And it shows right at the beginning of the footage that there's this puff of smoke. It's not clear if it's a debris cloud or, what it's composed of. But people were pointing to it and saying, oh, could this be, indicating the point of detonation, whether it be, a bomb on the plane, whether it be a missile strike, what have you. And that's a theory a lot of people are playing with. People have noted, for example, the lack of trail of exhaust that you might expect with some types of missiles. You're also, it shows you the size of the point of the explosion. Whereas with a fairly large air defense missile, perhaps you might expect more. I know that Radio and Nukes and I were chatting about trying to go out and find examples of different Russian air defense munitions being tested to try to look at the shape and size of the debris cloud. But for the time I put into it, 30, 40 minutes, I found lots of launch test firings, but very few that showed any kind of detailed detonation for air defense systems. I don't know, Nukes, did you ever find anything on that front?
I found some images from Ukraine from the conflict, but they were not, the exact system and exact missile type in use was not really well known. So, it was really hard to verify or use these to compare.
Yeah, exactly. There hasn't been enough detail that we can look at this video and say it's likely this or likely that. But this sort of debris cloud is one of the more interesting points that hasn't been fully explained that may hint toward what may have happened. The second item there in the nest is the geolocation of that footage. And so in that case, because it was right near this tower, I don't recall if it has a windmill at the top or what the tower is for, but it allowed for a pretty confident geolocation of the point where it was filmed from and the direction of filming, as you can see there. And it turned out that if you were to scroll back a bit to look at the geolocation where the fuselage fell, this direction pointed almost exactly to it. So it was actually quite well done because this was done before the location of the wreckage was known. That also allows you to get a sense of, relative to so you can know which way the camera is pointing, and it gives you a sense of relative to the way the camera was pointing, which way was the plane flying, how did it fall, those sorts of things. So you can get a sense of the flight track. And it does look like its momentum of the plane was effectively along the flight track you would expect out towards St. Petersburg. And so when Radio and Nukes mentions that they may have taken a turn, that's possible, but it doesn't seem like it was a hugely sort of evasive maneuver. And Nukes, if you want to jump in.
Okay, sorry.
Yep.
I would say too, the burn time on a 48 N6 missile is like 10 to 11 seconds is from what I can find. So if it was S-300, we wouldn't see a smoke trail from the exhaust of the engine. The engine would have already burned out at that point. Other systems, however, short-range systems, definitely lacking a exhaust trail. So I don't know if you can rule them out, but you can maybe exclude those a little bit at this point or make them less likely.
Fair enough. And that's often the case, is that you can't necessarily, if you have 5 or 6 options, you can't necessarily narrow it to one, but the hope would be that you can take, 5 or 6 and narrow it down to, say, 2 or 3 with one piece of info, and then a subsequent piece, narrow it down to another 2 or 3, and then hopefully eventually that leads you to one option. We're just not there yet. And so there are a few other reports. Now, when you start relying on eyewitness reports, it's a little harder, to take them at face value. The third item in the nest is a report coming from a channel on Telegram that says that there were 2 loud bangs. So they heard one loud bang, they looked up, and then they saw and heard a second explosion. And if you were to, this could also be consistent with that best video that I put up as the first item in the nest. The idea being, why do you start filming? And it's probably because you hear an explosion, and then, it took a certain amount of time to get their phone set to take a video and then get it pointed. And by that point, if there was a second explosion, the second explosion would have just occurred. And that's what they caught on video. You wouldn't, for example, if there were a mechanical failure, unless that mechanical failure caused a very loud noise that would prompt you to start filming. And I'm not sure all failures would generate that kind of noise. It can start to shape the likelihood of the various outcomes. And I have heard some folks suggest that if air defense systems were used, it wouldn't be atypical to fire 2 rounds at a target. Okay, the fourth item back there. Now this is just a warning, since we're talking about the best available video, that there was a second video that went around, and I'm just pointing it out so you're not confused. I don't know whether this was circulated ironically, because this is apparently the IL-22 that Wagner shot down during its mutiny in June. And people were sharing it around claiming it was Prigozhin's plane. Now, it's not clear if it's just because it's one of the most recent shoot-down videos that exist, or whether people were intentionally being ironic because of the symmetry between Wagner shooting this plane down and Prigozhin's plane then being shot down. But in any event, it's different. Obvious analysis of it shows that the planes have different profiles, but also this plane is in flames as it falls, whereas Prigozhin's did not appear to be. And so some people were confused, wondering if some video caught it earlier in the fall and some caught it later. But in fact, this is just an older video. Go ahead, Nukes.
Part of that IL-22 BP video that's odd, that I think threw a lot of people off, is that the IL-22 is a 4-engine plane. And if you freeze it towards the end of the video when the plane approaches the ground, clearly you can only see 2 engines. If you go to the very beginning of that IL-22 video, you can see the wings are longer, and if you look real closely, you can even see what looks to be 2 little debris trails and smoke clouds coming out from the plane itself. So it appears that those engines departed the airframe just due to G-forces and aerodynamic forces during the shoot down. And I think that is part of the reason it was very confusing, because the wings are much shorter and it looks like a 2-engine plane when you get the best view of it towards the ground when it turns towards the camera. So I think that accounts for some of the confusion.
Those are good points. Yeah, and so if you guys come across, there are basically 2 videos I've seen of the plane falling. If you guys come across anything you think is a great video that would show even better or earlier in the whatever happened in the air than that first video I put up, which is I think now the second item in the nest, then let us know. We'd like to look at it. So continuing in the nest, it's now the 6th item back, but sort of the 6th and 7th, I'm not going to entertain every possibility for the shoot down. Sometimes it's helpful to know what's being said about it. There are so many suggestions that I think aren't particularly serious. We don't need to go through them all. But that's 6th item back in the nest. It's a tweet from the account Gray Skull. And it includes some imagery, and several other accounts noted the same thing, that show what they're suggesting may be fragmentation damage to the wings and fuselage of the plane. And some people in reporting on it have gone so far as to say, oh, it's consistent with an S-300 or, this warhead or that warhead. And, for example, I've heard some people say, well, an S-300 would be too much of an explosion. Now, but I am not an expert on these matters. I'm pointing this out as something that has not been explained, and it has not sort of excluded any outcome. I don't know whether an internal detonation to the aircraft could have caused similar damage. I don't know whether any, breaking up in the air could have caused similar damage. So, but go ahead, Nukes.
So the one thing to remember about these missiles that we're looking into now, again, I can't say for sure or have basically no evidence, but the S-300 system, the Buk system, others as well are radar guided systems. And they're not going to come in and follow the heat signature of the plane or, the best contrast up towards the sky. They're going to come in towards the plane where it's, you've got the best radar signature essentially as they track the plane in. So it's not the angle in which that came in. If it was the side of the plane, especially the side of the plane where it appears to be missing a wing, there was very little that I could see in any of the pictures from that side of the plane remaining, or at least in the pictures. So that's one thing to just to keep in mind when looking at this imagery, is that there could be a substantial portion of that side of the plane that, this thing was moving at 500 plus knots that, just got totally disintegrated due to aerodynamic forces.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And so again, I'm not the following ideas. I'm not promoting any of them. It's partly that they're out there, and some of these are just sort of data points, essentially. If you have a look at the first three items in the nest now, just before we started our conversation, I saw this tweet that apparently this aircraft, the claim is that this aircraft was up for sale, and that they were allowing potential buyers to go on the airplane and look around. And so if nothing else, this video is purported to be on the inside of the aircraft. So you can get a sense of layout and the, the like. I'm sure that there are some out there who say it may be suspicious that the public was allowed permission onto the aircraft the day before it crashed. But again, I don't know that we can make anything of it at this point. But it is interesting to see the interior. The second item back, the Russians appear to be emphasizing the potential that it was an explosive device on the plane and not a missile. Now, whether that serves their interests, we can set that aside. In that they haven't been, particularly forthcoming in their statements, but we'll get to those down the road. I've seen a couple of theories. Early on, there was a claim that there was a last-minute gift of some wine that was received and taken on board that some people were pointing to. The second item in the nest refers to the fact that apparently in the debris, there were reportedly discovered ammunition and grenades. And one suggestion is that it could potentially just have been careless handling of ammunition that caused a detonation. And again, I mean, is that plausible? Possibly. I don't know that it's inconsistent with any of the available evidence, but if you guys have any particular thoughts on that, let me know. So there's the fact that the public was on board the day before. They're claiming that there were munitions, including grenades, in the debris after the fact. And then the third item back is a report that apparently police in Russia are now trying to find Prigozhin's personal pilot, who was not flying this particular flight, and they want to speak with him regarding the investigation. And it's not, it's not clear that they're saying, he did anything in particular, but with many of the similar events, the Russians don't seem shy about trying to pin it on a sacrificial lamb. So if I were this Prigozhin's normal personal pilot, I would be fairly nervous. So that was some of the video evidence. Now, there have been some statements by the U.S. officials and by various Western media outlets. And interestingly, some of these claims conflict with one another. So I'm just putting them up in the nest, if you'll bear with me. The first of them, which will be up in just a moment, comes from the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal came out and they basically had said that they did not believe that it was a surface-to-air missile. And then the Financial Times, I believe that the Financial Times actually may have come out first. And what they said was that U.S. officials were telling them that it was Russian air defense that shot down the plane. And then Reuters came out, and a journalist for Reuters, Phil Stewart, had said, scoop, the U.S. believes that it was a surface-to-air missile originating inside Russia that shot down the plane. So we've now heard it's not a surface-to-air missile. It's air defense, generically. It is a surface-to-air missile. And then the should be the fourth item now. The BBC came out and said, well, it was very likely the FSB. And now whether the FSB would be operating air defense systems, is unlikely, but clearly we're getting a huge range from Western media. I'll pause for a moment, though. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Just for a little bit of context, what I'd like to point out is that if it was, in fact, a surface-to-air missile of some kind, basically anything larger than a man-pads, the U.S. government will know fairly quickly. CBERS are infrared/optical early warning satellite constellation, which was its primary purpose is to detect ballistic missile launches, but it has sufficient resolution to be able to detect objects as small as individual SAM and MRL launches. Previously, we had used this to fairly quickly identify the source of the Ukrainian airliner that was shot down in Iran. Because of CBERS, we were able to quickly identify an Iranian tour as responsible for shooting down that airliner.
Well done.
While John is distracted, I'll note he's making great points. The fifth item back in the nest, I doubled up. So it's actually, I'll delete one of them. It will be the fifth in a moment. But it's the tweet from Tyler Rogaway. And he writes for The War Zone. And today they put out a whole explainer on how CBERS works. So that complements John's comments. If you'd like to understand how the satellite works, do have a look at that article. We'll come back to John when you're available, put your hand up. Go ahead, Radio and Nukes.
I just wanted to add to beyond CBERS, there's a whole array of ELINT satellites and technology that the West and the U.S. especially has that could detect the tracking radar, the 92N6, if this was something like S-300 or really any radar-guided system of any sort of power. So you have that as well, and there's multiple other ways this could be confirmed. You've got human intelligence and so on, but I think it would be, as John says, I think it would be highly unlikely if this was especially a large surface-to-air missile, something like the S-300 system, that the U.S. wouldn't have data on it. Now, how they would release that, when they would release it, and what they would say, I don't know. We'll have to give that some time.
Those are great points. And so hopefully the U.S. will be clearer. And I wanted to present that whole roller coaster ride of the different media outlets that's essentially said contradictory information, in each case effectively citing, anonymous U.S. officials. Interestingly, there was a press conference this afternoon. And so if you have a look, the sixth item back, our friend Colby was sort of live tweeting some comments from that are backed up by other media reporting. And at that news conference, the Department of Defense came out and said that they don't have any confirmation to confirm whether this was a surface-to-air missile or a bomb. but we have more detail on that from Colby.
Thanks. I'll just add to this that particularly the claims that it was a surface-to-air missile, because as Michael pointed out, there were a lot of outlets with their sources suggesting that this was what was responsible. General Ryder emphasized that the Department of Defense was not of the opinion that a surface-to-air missile was responsible for this. Now, that doesn't mean that SAM was not in fact responsible. That's just what they're saying right now. So these points about CBERS and its capability to detect these launches, the United States may in fact have information confirming what was responsible, but they may just be electing to not share that intelligence right now. But currently, that's the official position of the Department of Defense, is that it wasn't a surface-to-air missile, and they don't have any indication of it being a bomb or anything to say about what it might have been. So that's their position right now.
But it is a reminder to be careful, especially in the initial day after a big event where the media is citing unnamed U.S. official sources, because we've seen several times during the course of the war that those sources turn out to not be correct. I mean, when they claim they're U.S. official sources, they're probably more often correct than not. But the fact that there are notable instances where they were wrong, I think, just means be cautious, particularly in the first hours. Go ahead, Nukes.
One other thing to remember too, this is a big integrated air defense system that we're talking about. And I'm looking at 4 sites right here. There's others that would have seen this plane. And you're talking about potentially hundreds of people in that chain. If it is air defense, ground-based air defense anyway, there are a lot of people that have got to be quiet if this, if it was going to be covered up or if it hasn't come out to this point. So that is one thing I can't quite get over in my head. If this was air defense, there's just too many people. Somebody would have likely have said something, in my opinion.
Right. But of course, this begs questions like in those photos that appear to show, fragmentation damage to the wings and fuselage, that must have been from some other type of detonation that is not, air defense.
It could be air to air.
It's possible. Interestingly, when you say the air defense chain would require a lot of people to stay quiet, at the same time, at that kind of altitude, and with the available air-to-air range, do you think that there would have been reports from the ground of other aircraft up, or would it have been difficult to observe from the ground?
Well, if you note the weather, it was kind of overcast. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't know, if it was air to air. They have some pretty long range air to air missiles, but it's a pretty risky maneuver, especially with the amount of other air traffic that happens to be in that area. So I don't know. I haven't looked into that side of it in detail yet, but I would just think there would be a lot less people involved if you're going to try to keep something quiet, if you sent somebody up in a fighter to take the plane. I mean, it may not have been a missile. I mean, it could be guns, but I would have thought that if it was guns, we would have seen the intercepting aircraft on some of these videos.
Right. And so if the U.S., General Ryder is saying he thinks it's not air defense, then there are these alternative theories, right, about was it something that was planted? The BBC is saying that, their expert is saying the FSB was likely involved. There are just a bunch of other alternatives to try to work through. And all these pieces that are being written about Putin killing Prigozhin using air defense in the face of everybody, if it turns out not to have been air defense, then, their point may still be valid, but the premise of, look how blatantly they're doing it, they're using the Russian military to carry it out, might not actually be true. So people are I think there are a lot of people jumping ahead. Go ahead, John.
One thing I'd also add regarding U.S. LN capabilities is that in addition to detecting potential missile launches, we can also see them turn on their radars from our recce satellites in orbit. I again referenced the Iranian tour that shot down that Ukrainian airliner. In addition to Seabears observing the two missile launches, one of our other constellations observed it activate its fire control radar. So again, if it was a surface-based missile system, we definitely would have seen it. If it was air-to-air, I'm not sure if we would be able to detect like a MiG or a Suhoi's radar. Maybe we can, maybe we don't. I have no idea, but I guess that's also a possibility.
Well, that's interesting. That may mean there are possible scenarios that the U.S. could have detected and therefore have better sense of what happened. The question is whether they make that public and under what circumstances.
The Iranian one, let me see here, how long after the incident, because we publicly disclosed this. Let's see here. I think that was publicly disclosed on January 9th. Yeah, we released that information within 24 hours.
Okay, well, interesting. And I mean, that would, incentives to release the information and so on kind of get a little bit further into speculation. But if you're saying previously they released it quickly, maybe we should just wait a little while longer. So there were some other things that were happening at the same time as the crash occurred that are interesting and not completely explained. And so I have some details in this block on the other aircraft that was up and the known passengers. So if you have a look at the first item that's up there, this is a tweet from Mark Krutov. And what he notes, there was this second plane up. And for a time yesterday, after the news broke of the crash, there were some accounts that were reporting that the other plane was just circling Moscow. Or some were suggesting it was taking a very odd flight track, zigzagging and so on. When I spoke with friends of ours and said, hey, there are reports of this other plane up that may be relevant, very quickly they looked at flight tracks and said, oh, well, it's landed. And the flight track they showed suggested it made a pretty smooth U-turn and landed. And not that it was circling and not that it was zigzagging. And so I'm not sure whether some of those claims were mistaken or whether other flight tracking systems maybe showed the flight path as being less smooth than others. But I'm not sure why those claims were being made. Yeah, go ahead, Nukes.
So when you see those paths that look jerky and weird and like the plane is flying in an octagon instead of a nice smooth circle, that's usually troubles with the MLAT tracking system in the crowdsourced ADSB/Mode-S platforms like Flight Radar 24. They have a harder time. They have to see the plane from multiple receivers, and then they basically triangulate it, but not with direction like you would normally think. They do it by the time of arrival to each one of the stations. So it's not uncommon in areas of poor MLAT coverage to see that, jerky, weird pattern. And, one service might have a nice smooth curve. The other one might have the jerky pattern, and that is just due to who's feeding to what service in the area usually.
Right. So I'm just not making very much of the suggestion that there was irregularities there. But go ahead, John.
Just because I want to nerd out on this specific point, it's in this case it's trilateration, not triangulation. Distinction being if you're working with angles, i.e. direction, it's triangulation. If you're working with distance or time of travel for, say, a light pulse, then it's trilateration or multilateration in the most general case.
We're all slowly learning. And so in any event, starting from the first item in the nest, apparently that flight turned around and landed. But what's caught the attention, so Mark Krutov is one of the editors at Radio Free Europe, and he does some insightful things. And he noted that the plane didn't land at the commercial airport, but that it landed at Ostafyevo Airport, which is apparently used exclusively by the Russian military and by Gazprom. And it's not clear why it landed there. I put out a tweet, 2 or 3 hours after the crash, where it occurred to me that they had just released the passengers list for the downed plane. But it would be very interesting to see the passengers list for this secondary plane, because if it is connected for Wagner use, there may be some other senior Wagner leaders who were on that plane. And if it landed at a military airport, are those Wagner leaders now in custody? There would be interesting insight there. But of course, no passenger list was released. It was then announced today that this same plane, so the second tweet in the nest, is apparently flying today down to Azerbaijan, to Baku, or Baku. And it's not clear why, it's not clear who's on it. So that generated maybe not confusion, but some interest. But then if you, and I'll go to you in just a moment, Nukes, but if you have a look at the third item in the nest, from the tweet from Eric Toller, and Eric put together a terrific thread on all these events. And so this is drawing from down thread a fair bit. He was looking into this, and he noted there's a news outlet over there that called up the plane's operator to ask about the relationship with Prigozhin, and they claimed that they were not related, for what that's worth. They also, Eric, in the next tweet in his thread, noted that there's a registration number on the back of the plane, as photographed recently, that connected with some kind of what was the name of it? It's like a Chinese company. Where is it? Yeah, that it was registered to Jeju China Castle, which apparently is an unrelated entity. And so it's not clear whether there was just some mistake in the media thinking that this plane maybe was rented by Wagner in the past, or perhaps not exclusively used by them, and that perhaps it's owned by another entity and was just coincidentally in the air yesterday. So it's just not clear. This could be consistent with their being forced to land at Ostafyevo if even the Russian authorities believed that it may be related to Wagner. They may have been compelled to land there, even if they were unrelated. So if anybody listening hears more detail on who runs that plane, who owns that plane, feel free to pass it along. I would be interested to hear. Go ahead, Nukes.
I will say, if you were to say if you needed to move aircraft from one airport in a large city to another, that you're never going to see one just fly a straight path there. You're going to see it circle around the traffic patterns and avoid the active runways at the airport, the active traffic patterns. So it wouldn't be unusual for a plane to take off and circle in this big wide arc around and then come and land at an airport across the city. That's fairly common, because you just can't fly the straight route due to traffic patterns and what the active runway is and so on.
Fair. Given that that other airport is apparently restricted to military and Gazprom, it then does beg the question, though, why was it at the commercial airport moving over to the military one? But I mean, if it were, for example, up for lease, or maybe an entity owns it, but it is also rented out, there are various possibilities that I'm sure folks who follow plane registration and maybe dig into some Russian corporate entities could pin down a little better. And more for background, now, the fourth item in the nest, it's a tweet by Christo Grozev, who is one of the founders of Bellingcat. And several people put out the list of passengers who were on that aircraft. But I appreciated Christo's, because if you were to scroll down in his thread, actually, sorry, it may not be there. It may be in a separate thread. In any event, it's linked in the next item in the nest. Christo did a thread where he went through some of the names of the people who were on the plane to explain their roles in Wagner. So if you look at the next item back, which is the 5th, the tweet from Jack Margolin, he talks about how almost everybody on board was linked to Wagner. And interestingly, he gives the M numbers, which is a link to the Mirotvorets registry, which is sort of like a registry of enemies of Ukraine that's been in existence for quite a long time. The Russians paint it as controversial, but essentially it's just like an open source opponents list. And so individuals will have numbers in that index where you can look up additional background information. And so Jack points out who Propustin and Chekalov were, and he links to tweets from Mark Krutov, and I think he also links to a couple of tweets from Christo Grozev explaining these individuals' backgrounds, including apparently one of the enforcers of Wagner and one of their primary logisticians. So it seems like it was quite a decapitating strike. Of course, Utkin, who was sort of the right-hand man of Prigozhin, was on the flight as well. So if you want to dig into their backgrounds, not only are the names there, and there are a few references to call signs, but again the links to their index numbers in the Ukrainian database. The next couple of items I want to put up are some of the political reactions, just to cover them. So if you bear with me, I'm just putting them up. The first of which is the statement that Putin made today. And so he reportedly reached out to Prigozhin's family, and he offered in general his condolences to all those killed in the crash. But he also goes into a discussion of his history in terms of when he met Prigozhin, and is not particularly upset, but is not very explicit about his role.
there might be like a bomb waiting under Prigozhin's deathbed or something 70 years from now, something like that. But I didn't think he would do it in 2 months. But maybe it's because it ate away at him or something like that, or there was all the different reports of the kind of continued infighting, right, going on within the MOD even after the mutiny. And I think another thing that I would add, just a quick caveat before I'll stop talking, was Surovikin was there were new developments in Surovikin's case the day before. So I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but there's just a lot of odd coincidences, just like the plane you were talking about before that landed at the military airport. Lots of odd coincidences. Also, the other fact that we don't have the passenger list for that plane, right? Why wasn't that one released? So there's a lot of coincidence that we still got to delve into. The last thing I'll say, sorry, I said the last one was the last one, but Kobe and was it Radio and Nukes who was talking about like the space-based assets that can detect SAM launches and things like that. That does, right? That information coincides with the U.S. government's original analysis. Now I don't know. A lot of it's like it's either unconfirmed or it's quote unquote an anonymous defense official, like they say, and then the DoD will then immediately refute that. So Pat Ryder's been fighting with Reuters and other things like that for the past couple of days. So you got to give him some kudos for that. But one thing that they did say, right, is that they don't have evidence that it was a SAM a SAM shot it down. Which the assets they have, if they were able to see a SAM launch, I would assume they would say that. So that's it.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we did. You may have joined recently. About 5 minutes ago, we did talk about what the Western media has said about it and what the DoD has come out and said in terms of they don't have evidence. And the Pentagon press conference today. You made two other points. You made one that was sort of about this was almost perfectly foreseeable or was inevitable, and I'll speak to that in a moment. And then you also spoke to the developments around Surovikin, and I do have those coming up in like 3-4 minutes from now, so we'll get around to those. So if you want to add anything then, come back in. So what I wanted to speak to now was just the sort of brazenness and potentially social implications of this and how it's being interpreted in any event. I'll put it that way. So the first two items in the nest speak to that. The first is a tweet by Konstantin Sonin, who I believe is a Russian studies, political economist at the University of Chicago. And a little bit earlier, I had said that some think pieces were being written on the assumption that it was an air defense missile that was used to shoot this down, which may not have been a correct assumption, and that might undercut some of these arguments. But Sonin is essentially saying, think how crazy it is that in what should be a democratic, fairly modern country, we're contemplating the idea that an assassination of somebody in the leadership's inner circle may have been carried out with an air defense missile, meaning that the Russian army was used against Russian civilians on Russian territory. And just how blatant and sort of brazen it is. And keep in mind that in shooting the plane down, there were some innocent people on that plane who were not Wagner operatives. There was a profile put up, I can't remember if it was Chris O. Wiki or somebody else put up one on one of the flight attendants who apparently would occasionally fly on that private plane and was not actually working that day, but given the opportunity to transit to St. Petersburg and was among those killed. So Sonin is just pointing out, if an air defense missile were used, how blatant it is and how far the norms in Russia have fallen to have the Russian military be used in this way. And similar to that, the second item back from Jim Scudo, who, if I'm not mistaken, is he at CNN? Yes, he is. And he's passing along an article from The Atlantic, and the title sort of says it all, a very public execution in Russia, and the idea about how much this could be an explicit message to the elite, essentially saying you're not safe, including flying in your own country. But again, like the degree of brazenness may be slightly diminished if it's found that it was an FSB plot using an explosive device as opposed to an air defense missile. But obviously, it's sort of at maximum brazenness if it was an air defense missile. I wanted to include a point because after the Wagner revolt, there was back and forth about how much it may have weakened Putin. And, there were lots of articles talking about it weakened Putin greatly. And then because there was uncertainty about the way the deal with Prigozhin would work, Prigozhin was traveling apparently freely back and forth to Russia, then traveling to Africa. And there appeared to be almost a normalization. Some people started to come out and say, oh, well, maybe Putin has consolidated his power here and it's actually a positive for him. Now, this is a tweet from Garry Kasparov. It's the third in the nest. It's only his opinion, but somebody had, put to him in comments, is it possible Putin comes out of this stronger? And Kasparov's opinion, now, admittedly, Kasparov has a great track record of making correct calls about the direction of Russian events. And he says, no, when a dictator is reduced to murdering members of his inner circle and replacing his own generals, this is a very dangerous situation, and that there's no trust among those who remain. And so obviously that's a political opinion. You guys may have your own. The debate goes on, but I thought Gary's opinion was, an important one to listen to. And then fourth item in the nest, last in this block, this goes to the comment John was sort of getting toward, which is we're having a lot of people come out now and bring up things they wrote a month and a half ago, just after the revolt, saying, Prigozhin is doomed. That a lot of them were second guessing in the last few weeks as it looked like the situation had normalized. But now they're coming out and saying, oh, I knew it all along. And this is an example of that. So Tyler Rogoway does great work. He writes for the War Zone. We put up some of his other articles earlier. But several people put this out. And Tyler's saying there was no other way that this would have ended, not even a question. And I've seen some people use the term inevitable. And I mean, maybe this is quibbling. Just as an analyst, I don't tend to think anything is inevitable. There are lots of things that are very likely, or where there's political or social pressures pushing things in a certain direction. But I do like to think that there's agency for these players, including for Putin, and that this outcome was maybe not inevitable, even if and John had made the point, I had thought Prigozhin was doomed, but I had thought maybe somebody comes for him, when he's in bed in many years. And when somebody says this is inevitable, you have to ask them, well, did you expect this timing? Did you expect it to be this public? Did you expect it to come from this direction as opposed to maybe a rival, in a few years who emerges? And so I'm just not very impressed with the people all saying, I knew it all along. It was absolutely going to happen. To move along a little faster, because I think I have 2 or 3 more on the crash, and then we'll get into updates on the offensive. Instead of breaking some of these out, I'll just speak to a few of these in the next block. So I brought together a sample of reactions. Really, this is just in case you wanted to read what the mood is in different quarters. And so included in this tweet, there's an article from Medusa that is a roundup of lots of big Russian public figures and their initial reactions to the Prigozhin's crash. This was before his death was confirmed. And so you get a variety of people in here, some denying it, some saying, oh, I'll wait to confirm it's actually occurred. And by the way, I'm not going to go very deeply into the whole set of reports about the body couldn't be conclusively identified and some people claiming it's being sent for DNA analysis. There's still a very small chance something odd could happen, but I think it's so unlikely that I'm not going to spend time addressing it. So there's the Medusa article. There are mixed reactions both from Wagner affiliated groups and from the Kremlin. So you'll see there's a tweet from Sam Bendet where you're seeing some Wagner official channels come out with voice messages that say, all Wagner commanders, we don't believe the news that we're hearing, and we're asking you not have any marches or take any actions, have memorials until you get further instructions from us. But then you see all these memorials popping up, right? You saw the headquarters of Wagner apparently light its windows up in the shape of a cross. Then you have the roughly affiliated group, Rusich. So there's a tweet in this, again, the first item in the nest, the tweet from Alec Bertina, where Rusich puts out a lesson that's, not memorializing. It's more philosophical. It just says, let this be a lesson to you all. You always have to go to the end, which is not, a very empathetic answer, but it's maybe in keeping with their style. You also saw mixed reactions from the Kremlin. So there's a tweet here from Anton Gerashenko where you see the two stages. In the first, you see propagandist Solovyev, who is essentially saying, look, we don't know what's happened. Wait for further instruction. Don't take any wild action. A lot of people interpreted that as he had been told he hadn't received his marching orders yet, and therefore he didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to break. But then, the next day, you'll see the tweet from Julia Davis, who tracks Russian media closely. And you'll see that both on his social media profile and on his nightly show, he went on to say that Ukraine was responsible, that it was influenced by France and America, that NATO as a whole is an enemy, and that Wagner must take revenge on them. And so, the response is, number one, it looks like he didn't know what to say initially. And then number two, he sort of took the throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. So that was it for reactions. This next block, and again, I'll put it up as a whole block. To the extent it inspires any conversation, do feel free to come up and chime in. It's up for me now. This is the question some people are asking about, why would this happen now? And I think that's worth conversation. You'll see that there are some tweets here from various folks. There's one from Michael Wasiura, who essentially is, there are lots of people saying this, but saying that, well, by delaying here, Putin got 7 weeks to see who among Wagner's leaders would decide to move to Belarus. He had time to largely disarm them, take away their heavy weaponry. He put them at a distance so that now if they decide to react, they have to leave Belarus. It's much easier to track them, those sorts of things. Partly tactical, partly seeing how people's loyalty would break by taking time for it. There's also a tweet here from Rob Lee where he's essentially saying that the Russian security services would have needed time to figure out how to take control of Wagner's activities overseas. And we'll have some details on that in just a moment. And also the fact that with one fell swoop, whoever did this managed to take out 4 or 5 of the senior leaders of Wagner at the same time, is also looks like it was carefully orchestrated. So those are some reasons why you might say, well, why now? Or why did it take some time? But I just want to make the point, and I know I often point out the limitations of knowledge, and that might seem like it's an easy, slam dunk or easy way to win points. But I think it's important to keep in mind there are a lot of things we don't know. So that third item down, and this is all in response to a question that was asked by Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor of The Economist. So I'd invite you to explore the replies more fully. But I note that when Shashank is asking, why did Putin wait 2 months? I'm saying that, well, this assumes that Putin even made his mind up 2 months ago, right? Which goes to my argument about inevitability. And it's entirely possible that, Putin was open to trying to work things out for a time. He may have been waiting to see how power would shift before deciding whether Prigozhin remained a threat or perhaps, demonstrated he no longer was a threat. There's also the possibility of irrational decision-making coming into it, emotionality or otherwise. And then there's also the possibility that this decision may not have been made primarily by Putin, right? There are different interest groups, of course, in the leadership of Russia, who, for all we know, could be in a contest, a power struggle. And it's possible that, maybe this action happened because Putin got advice that it needed to happen, and that it wasn't at his initiative. So these are all possibilities. And again, I'm just pointing those out to say that we don't know how this decision came to be made. And so I think that if you just automatically assume everything is done by Putin, it's all done rationally and with full information, and the decision was made months ago, that you're really limiting the possibility for analysis. So these next 2 points, and so you know what, I'll break these out to the front of the nest so that you can see them. But this is what John was speaking to about Surovikin. And so the first of these, which should be up in just a moment, it's a tweet by Rob Lee passing along that it was 2 days ago that it was announced that Surovikin had been removed as commander of the Russian aerospace forces. But interestingly, a lot of that coverage didn't mention the fact that Surovikin was moved to another position in the MOD. And so whether that's, he has any real authority in that other position, or he's been, essentially neutered, isn't clear. But what it does mean, there's no announcement that he's being arrested or disappeared at the moment. And so this may be a downgrade and not a complete removal from the field of play. That will remain to be seen. But then interestingly, the announcement was made that Colonel General Afsalov would be appointed in Surovikin's place as as acting commander of Russian aerospace forces. And then the second item up there is a tweet from the Institute for the Study of War, which notes that Wagner sources are claiming that the Russian general staff has purged all the proteges of Surovikin as well. And so to the extent that those sources are to be believed, it looks like there were several plays being made at the same time. And I think that timing is coincidental, or may not be coincidental. John, did you have any more thoughts on the connection to Surovikin?
Yeah. The one thing that I would say about Surovikin right away is that whether or not he hasn't been disappeared, right? I'm glad you mentioned that, but he's definitely been sidelined. I think we kind of saw this. If some of you guys may remember when they found out that there was a large amount of gun decking going on as well in the Russian Pacific Fleet, when they had done their big review, obviously probably in response to the amount of the hit that their logistics took, and then their ability to replenish and reconstitute forces took because of all the corruption going on within the force. So they kind of did essentially this massive audit. And when the time came for the audit to come to the Pacific Fleet, they found out, well, the Pacific Fleet there, was getting these funds, this money, and it wasn't going into the upgrades of the ships and certain upgrades and other things like that when it came to reconstitution and other things like that. And we now see their Pacific Fleet getting fleshed out. But one change they did make was they sacked the commander and put him in charge of something like it was somewhere along the lines of like recreation for soldiers, like retired soldiers or veterans or something like that. And I can't speak to the exact position that they have now put Surovikin in, but I would be willing to bet it's something very similar to that. I think they wouldn't go as far as to unalive him or outwindow him, or shoot him down like they did Prigozhin, but because of the fact that he has so many proteges, right? But it still wouldn't surprise me if they did. but I wouldn't put it past them, right? But I don't see them doing that, at least right now. I don't think they would make two big blows to the kind of the ego of the opposition so quickly. But nothing Putin always surprises us. So
thanks for that, John. So I'm just getting the next couple of points up in the nest, and this is meant to speak to whether
Michael, are you there? May have a slight pause. Just in case you're looking for any of the items that have been shared in the nest, they're in the replies to the space. So if at any stage you're wanting to look at anything that's been shared at a later time during the week, or if you listen to the replay, you can find all the resources in the replies. And if you're interested in letting your friends know that the conversation is occurring, feel free to retweet the space with the button at the bottom right. We'll see if Michael is back. No. Oops.
Sorry about that, guys. Sorry, I had to reset there. The interface for the space froze up, but I'll keep going. So the next block of material is about whether Wagner can continue to operate given the loss of all of the senior leadership. So I'm just going to put that material up in the nest in a moment. The first item is going to be a tweet from Jack Margolin, who studies Wagner closely. And his thoughts on the matter are that while Wagner still has several senior leaders who are available, that for the most part, those leaders don't have the connections and resources, including potentially funds, in order to take care of, reforming Wagner. That informed opinion is interesting. Then, and again, these are just going to post in the nest and appear in just a moment. The second item is a tweet once again from Anton Gershenko, who is just passing along reports from Telegram that Wagner was convening its leadership in order to have a board meeting to figure out what their next steps would be. So it will be interesting to see if they come out in the next few days with an announcement about their intentions for how to continue. Yeah, so that's all populated now. So you can see Jack Margolin's tweet is the first item, saying essentially like he in his expertise doesn't believe they have what's necessary to continue. The board meeting is the second item. The third item back was, these are the little details that I appreciate that don't get a ton of coverage. Interestingly, both police and National Guardsmen in Russia were called out in the Rostov-on-Don region after the crash. And given that that is the city that they seized, that Wagner seized in its revolt, most notably, and that it's quite close to the air base where Wagner had conducted a lot of its training for many months before largely abandoning that training center and moving much of it to Belarus in the last 2 months. All these police were put on alert, and that's the sort of thing where those things didn't happen when the Wagner revolt began initially. And so it seems like there was more thoughtful or potentially faster response to tamp down any kind of disorder that might develop. The fourth item in the nest also highlighted that apparently shortly after the crash, there were strong mobile internet outages in the region around the Wagner camp in Belarus, suggesting that, again, steps were being immediately taken to limit the information flow both in and out of that camp. possibly to hinder Wagner's ability to react. So these are, again, interesting that it seemed like, I don't know if it suggests that there was advanced preparation because these events were expected to unfold, or whether it just means that systems were checked following the revolt in order to ensure that they were going to run well the next time. And so it's interesting to see some indications that those things happened. The fifth item in the nest, tweet from Mark Krutov, again at Radio Free Europe, noting that in the last few days, a fair chunk, I think he said something like 100 out of 270 tents at the Wagner camp in Belarus have been taken down. And he's saying this process had begun several days ago. And so it's probably not because fighters are leaving after the crash, but that there had been reports variously that either fighters were unsatisfied with the pay that they were being offered and leaving on their own initiative, or that there was a mismatch in expectations for funding, so that Russia was refusing to fund it, and then Belarus was saying, well, that wasn't the understanding, we're not going to fund it either. And and so those two ideas of a funding fight and or perhaps funding was okay at whatever level the governments wanted it to be, but that fighters were unhappy with it, so they were leaving. It will be interesting to use the same technique to continue to watch the number of tents at the camp, to see if the majority of the Wagner fighters, who I think at last count had been reported at just over 4,000, if a significant number of them leave the camp, possibly indicating maybe the last unwinding of Wagner as a force in the Russia-Belarus region. And then it will remain to be seen what happens to Wagner force in Africa. Last item in this block is the sixth item back. It's a tweet from Azov South, and it's a video of an address by Lukashenko today, where apparently, because in accepting Wagner into Belarus, he had to convince Prigozhin of that. And as part of that, it was reported that he was giving Prigozhin security guarantees about come to Belarus, you will be safe in Belarus. And I guess he would, I don't know if he was asked about them or whether he decided he needed to address them on his own. But the summary here is he's saying, well, this is an accident. It could happen to anybody. You can't guarantee anyone against an accident, which is kind of a weak response. And I'm sure Lukashenko is not particularly pleased that he was used briefly sort of as a fig leaf, to cover for Putin's plan, and then, made to suggest he was guaranteeing safety when Prigozhin was then immediately or, very shortly eliminated. So I'm going to put up the material for the next block. This block is about what we know so far about the continued operations in Africa. And so, again, these will go fairly quickly. Putting the last item up now. So the first item here, which will show up for you in just a moment, is a tweet by Christo Grozev, again of Bellingcat. And he's speaking to processes that had already been underway. The reports were, and if you click into this thread and sort of scroll up and down a few, you'll see it's part of a longer story he's telling. Reports were that Prigozhin had been in Africa, that he had rushed there because he was aware of ongoing efforts by Russian intelligence in order to displace Wagner's role in various parts of Africa, and that he quickly went to Mali in order to try to deal with that. Now, the suggestion was that he then hurried back to Russia, and it's not clear whether that's because he couldn't find satisfaction on the ground in Mali, and felt he had to appeal to Putin, or there were matters to take care of. But that's the story that's being pitched. And then specifically, several sources are saying they believe that General Andrei Averyanov, who is a Russian intelligence senior officer, apparently he is the individual who ran some of the operations with the attempts, for example, to assassinate the Skripals in the United Kingdom. And it was noted that he attended the Russia-Africa summit, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And people thought it was interesting that he should be there because he's so notorious. And now several places are reporting that this general, Averyanov, has been appointed as the Kremlin's point person in an effort to take over Wagner activities in Africa. And so that's to set the context. And it's interesting to think that the Kremlin may have believed that Prigozhin's primary interest was in his projects in Africa. That's where he saw his future value. And that if they had decided that it was time to take action against him, one way to be confident that they could draw him out would be to threaten those interests particularly. Now, that's entirely speculation, but I mean, it makes a kind of a sense. These next items are just to back up that narrative in case you hadn't seen them. The second item is some photographs of Prigozhin in Mali 3 or 4 days ago. And the third item back is a tweet from our friend Fabian, who spoke with us on African Matters about 2 weeks ago, who tracked the Wagner flights around Africa and then as they were returning back to Russia. So all of that's consistent with the narrative that Grozov sets out about Prigozhin rushing to Africa and then back. And it also maybe lends some credence to this idea of that particular Russian intelligence general being put in charge of trying to take over their activities there. The fourth item back, sorry, I'm just trying to get the Nest to cooperate with me. The fourth item back is a translation of a tweet from All Eyes on Wagner by our friend Cassius Belli. And he's noting that in the week prior to the plane crash, there had been increased focus on Russian Ministry of Defense efforts to recruit fighters for 2 alternative private military companies, Convoy and Reddit. And again, these reports are coming out from several fronts. So those may have been the activities that caused concern in Prigozhin that led him to head to Africa. And again, if you want to learn more about that, follow Cassius Belli and particularly follow All Eyes on Wagner, as I'm sure they'll keep digging to try to uncover more information. Now, several people had said, well, given Prigozhin's death, it was Wagner that had developed many of the relationships in Africa, and that it's those relationships that are most valuable to their activities there. If many of the Wagner operatives don't cooperate with the Kremlin or leave to do other things, they'll lose a lot of their influence in the region. And what you'll see with the fifth item in the Nest is that point was made by Dmitry Alperovich. And in response to that, there was this thoughtful point from the account of A.K. Magard, who is new to me. But he was essentially saying, like, look, there are lots of levers that Russia has politically over the governments of Africa and the people of Africa, including classic humanitarian aid, deliveries of grain, which we've talked about with Exit and the collapse of the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, potash and the like. There's also, military arms sales. We're seeing, delivery of helicopters and aircraft. All of those things will continue. And so just because Wagner's powers are reduced doesn't mean that Russia will cease to be a force in Africa. So I wanted to put that opinion out there. 2 last points on, and I know I've been dwelling on the political implications for a little while, but 2 last points on the fallout from Prigozhin's apparent death. This should be up in the nest now. So the first is a tweet. Sorry, it must just be populating. The first is a tweet from Jimmy Sec UK, passing along an article from the Financial Times. And the Financial Times said that they had several sources within the UK government who are now reporting that the UK is going to prescribe the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization within weeks. And I'm putting this up for the irony that they took so long in making this decision about terrorism designation that it may become irrelevant, right? Wagner will have ceased to exist. A question I don't have the answer to, but somebody listening may know, is if the UK has gotten to the point where they're willing to use these tools against Wagner, is that evidence specific because of activities carried out by Wagner operatives? Or do you think it's a change in political will in the UK and that there would now be a faster willingness to apply the same terrorism designations to other Russian PMCs like Reddit and Convoy that may be operating in Africa? Go ahead, Colby.
So the reporting around this was that the British government was working on their legal case, I guess, for this designation, gathering sufficient evidence to justify bringing the sanctions or labeling the designation and then the sanctions that may follow from that. I suspect that may be partially true, but it's certainly the case. And I believe the reporting touched on this as well, that there were an awful lot of political considerations that have been impacting the calculation about whether this designation would be made because of the very, very significant presence of Russian oligarch money within the United Kingdom. So I wouldn't be so confident that we're necessarily going to see more actions follow that could be applied to other Russian PMCs necessarily. Would be nice, but these other PMCs aren't necessarily as well established as Wagner, so that there may not be as much to sanction in terms of tangible assets that could be potentially frozen in Western banks. So that's definitely a good question, something to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, your point about assets is a good one. I do wonder if they have spent the political capital to come this far, whether they might want to go ahead with designation, terrorism designations, in order to make a political point, even if there aren't a lot of assets, to attach to. But again, if you're suggesting that there were a lot of potential Russian interests that had to be considered to come to this decision, maybe that was very case specific, and therefore it'll be hard to quickly replicate and just apply to the others. But I appreciate your input on it. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I believe it was actually Cassius Belli who posted this before, but they said something along those lines, right, which was actually pretty good, right? Right, Wagner may essentially have lost its head, but PMCs won't not be a thing for the indefinite future, right? I think PMCs will always play a part in Russia's foreign policy, especially you look at how big Wagner, the large part that they play in Russia's foreign policy, especially in Africa. I don't see Wagner going away, but I think Wagner, as we know it now, right, like you said before, will go away. But I think the PMCs will still, for the foreseeable future, will play a large part in Russia's foreign policy, and even more so than now, probably, because as their conventional force continues to get depleted in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, right, they're going to lean more and more on these PMCs, and we've kind of seen them when it comes to men and material, right? They essentially, after the Wagner coup, they took all Wagner's armored and all their mech stuff, and they're using it, right? And it's not just sitting in depots in like Wagner depots somewhere. They took it from them and used it. Not necessarily saying they would have done that should the Wagner have mutinied, but Wagner had already kind of been sidelined anyway after Bakhmut, so I would have seen that happening anyway. The one thing I am curious about is you mentioned the kind of shady guy, the general, right, who has been has played a part in past assassinations and things, and how it could have been a way to lure to kind of make Prigozhin think that he's kind of losing a grip on Wagner. Would you guys, anyone else, want to expand on that kind of? Because this is a theory that I haven't heard, but it's a pretty good one.
Well, we'll see if we can find anybody to add into that. We are. Sorry, I'm just looking at some administrative things. So, I had my say on it in that, the theory is just that that Prigozhin was so focused on activities in Africa that's what drew him in. I don't have any more information on the activities of that particular general, but I think you correctly highlight that that's a place to focus. And so I'm going to go away and look for some of the great resources who have been following Wagner and Russian intelligence activities, and see if I can find any more background on his role or who he works with, or what existing connections he may have in Africa. Interestingly, at that same Russia-Africa summit was Victor Bout, who is the arms dealer, who was held in a U.S. prison and ultimately traded in a prisoner swap, almost a year ago now. He was also at the Africa Summit, and I think he previously had some existing relationships there, and so it'll be interesting also to keep an eye on his role. So I'm sorry I can't add too much more, John, but you inspire me to go and look into your questions. We've also been joined by a new speaker, legally unprecedented. Did you want to chime in with anything on these points?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Michael. I'm first time on your speaker panel. I've been in and out of your spaces a few times. So I just want to chime in on this specific topic because, having been a bit, I wouldn't say closer to the action. I mean, obviously, UK and the US are, big supporter of the Ukrainian cause. But one thing that was advocate here, right? Recall at the time, I think it was the White House spokesperson, I think Karine Jean-Pierre. There were talks about 3.6 billion aid that was given in advance or something like that. Now you think about Putin's history. We got to take a step back at the time where the special military operation wasn't going that great, and Wagner, the head of Wagner, was so vocal against the Russian military that I don't think Putin is the kind of guy that would accept that. My thinking is maybe there was a bit of a back channeling here, and maybe could it be possible that the head of Wagner Group was having some discussion with the US or the UK, and to get this money and then turn around to march towards Moscow, and then he double crossed the US and the UK. That's just like a conspiracy theory, but it does fit the money and the timing. I'm just going to throw this out there.
Michael, you might be having an audio problem again, are you, or?
John's got his hand up, so.
Yeah, I see that. I'm just waiting to see if Michael wanted to come in first or whether he's having an audio issue. I'll go to John Larrier. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick note to Legally's point. The closest thing I saw to that, and you did obviously admit that it was kind of conspiracy-esque, right? But the closest thing I saw to that when it comes to Prigozhin involvement, where we heard a lot of that during the mutiny, that he was getting all this money. We generally saw that from the Russian side, and much of it was, if not all of it, was unsubstantiated. The closest thing I did see was, I believe it was Reuters, was reporting that, and it was like one single line, and I'll try and find the article and I'll throw it up in the nest if I could find it. But they did say that U.S. Officials had warned Prigozhin of the precarious nature of, essentially the position that he was in, but they didn't elaborate on that very much. But I do remember seeing that report a couple of days ago.
Hi guys, I'm back. Sorry for that audio glitch. Yeah, I was just, and I appreciate John's comments. I was just going to say, I don't think there's any evidence of coordination with Western, between Prigozhin and Western countries. Legally unprecedented. If you have any sources you'd like to come in where, people are...
They were anecdotal sources at best.
Yeah, okay.
Conjecture at best, and it's just timing. I just wanted to throw this out there,
Sure. The only thing I'll note, like, again, I'm not seeing any evidence of that. The only thing I'll note is there was very briefly a suggestion that Prigozhin may have been in contact with the Ukrainian intelligence when he was most unsatisfied and talking about withdrawing Wagner from Bakhmut. I can't recall. I try to avoid doing this where I don't have the source in front of me. I can't recall what the implication was that he may have suggested an openness to withdrawing forces and informing Ukraine that he would be withdrawing them in advance, something like that. But I'll try and find the source for that. But I don't think that suggests any sort of quid pro quo. I think it was more just him expressing an extreme level of frustration at the time.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just devil's advocate here. Just thinking, like, given Putin's history, I mean, what he's done, you mentioned earlier about Skripals and, him being an ex-KGB, true and true guy. He's not the kind of guy that would, accept, any form of challenge to his power. And, Wagner was openly challenging him when the military operations was really going bad. So for him to allow that to go on that long, either he didn't have the military capability to take on Wagner at the same time, or maybe that it was a bit of a dog and pony show. This is the only thing that doesn't fit, if you get what I mean. Without the data, he's trying to play through the scenarios, multiple scenarios in your head, right? Why would Putin allow that? Maybe
sure.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm not sure if you joined us recently. We did in the last, maybe it was 20 minutes ago or so, 25 minutes ago, we did go through a little bit of a why would it happen? Yeah, it may have been why would it happen now? And I kind of made the point that, look, it's very hard for us to speculate. There are so many moving parts we don't know about that I think we should be cautious about attributing everything solely to Putin's decision-making power, or that he's entirely acting rationally. Or he could be being advised by others. So I just think it's very hard to speculate. You note that the timing's anecdotal. We'll go to John, and then I hope to dive into updates on the offensive, and then get into a little bit on equipment in our remaining time. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be quick. I just want to quickly check my statement before I said the U.S. official had warned that I had misread the quote. The quote is actually that top Biden administration officials had publicly warned that Prigozhin could be killed by the Kremlin. So I just wanted to make sure that I didn't, spread any misinformation.
I know that I think it was just yesterday, yesterday, a video from just after the revolt of the CIA director essentially saying, Putin is a master of revenge, and that he didn't think Prigozhin would do very well. It started to be circulated widely again, so I know many American officials made similar comments. Last point, and John spoke to this maybe 2 minutes ago, just about PMCs are an element of Russian policy that's here to stay. So if you look at the first item in the nest, in support of that same idea, it's an article in the outlet Riddle, and so it was contributed to by Jack Margolin, and he really is focusing on it's not just Wagner, it is the idea of PMCs. And while Prigozhin was an important player, they will continue to be a force. So if you'd like more background on that, have a look at that article. Okay, moving on to updates on the offensive. I'm starting from the second item in the nest now. As usual, our space is to talk about themes and trends and factors that may influence things in the next days and weeks. They're not about up-to-the-minute commenting on the state of the front line. There are many excellent accounts that do that. I like to share maps with you guys. I like to share a variety of them because they present it in different ways. Some present units, that they have different tools built into them. They have different sources. So as usual, the list for today's maps include Institute for the Study of War, a link to Andrew Perpetua's maps, Defmon's map, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, Deep State, GeoConfirmed. As usual, I've also included the weather report from David Helms because that's always relevant. And a reminder that if you want a little bit more context on these maps, Andrew Perpetua does hold YouTube live streams where he screen shares his map and he will walk through all the changes and insights into it. And he does those live streams on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which is more convenient for European friends. So you could always join him tomorrow afternoon. Probably the big update on the front in the last few days, just before I get to the big update on Roborodny, is this third item back. I just want to note that just before beginning this space in the last hour, there were many reports beginning to come in of significant activity, including the Russians claiming that some missiles, I think they said they were S-200s, some missiles had been fired at Russian air bases. There were reports of several drones over Simferopol and Sevastopol, and there were suggestions of increased fighting in the area around Roborodny and working a little bit to the east to Verbov. And so there were videos that came out of Ukrainian units and movement. I won't include those, but it seemed like there's a significant push happening today. So we'll have lots of news. If there's anything breaking during the space that you think is significant on a longer term basis, rather than just a one-off or temporary update, feel free to come up and let us know. Because I'm kind of in a bubble here where I haven't been in the news for 3 hours, but it did seem like there was quite a lot happening. Again, I referred to it, but from the fourth item in the nest, this links to the account of General Zaluzhny the fourth item back in the nest is a link to a Wall Street Journal article that cited conversations that Zaluzhny had. He was pushing back on criticism he was hearing from U.S. counterparts, and essentially saying that the United States didn't understand the nature of the fighting that was going on, and that he said this is more like Kursk. This is not a question of gradual progress. And then the line that caught a lot of people's attention was Zaluzhny was not directly quoted, but a U.S. official said Zaluzhny had said to the U.S. that he felt like a breakthrough was imminent. And that is the quote that caught a lot of people's attention. So I wanted to put it in context because the saying a breakthrough is, or that they're on the verge of a breakthrough was floating around without the context of who said it to whom. There it is for you. Then The fifth item back is an interesting article on what's likely, what's possible in the offensive, written by Kagan and former General Petraeus, talking about how Ukraine still has plenty of scope to surprise on the upside. And it was a thoughtful article about how, a breakthrough can dramatically change the alignment of things in the field. And then the sixth item, tweet by Dmitry Alperovich, he's passing along an article from the New York Times that in that article, they claimed that in a teleconference between General Milley, UK Admiral Ratikin, and the US EUCOM commander, they spoke with Ukrainian General Zaluzhny, and they asserted that there was a misalignment or a misallocation of forces, and they suggested that more forces be set on the Tokmak direction. And the reports from the New York Times are that Zaluzhny heard those comments and agreed with them. And so, sorry, because I reset a moment, I lost my spot in my materials, but I'll put them up in a moment. So that was a block of material just to highlight the sort of ongoing narrative in terms of there being plenty of people in the U.S. like Petraeus and others who are optimistic for the potential for Ukraine to generate breakthroughs, that Zaluzhny himself is reported as saying that the Ukrainian forces are on the verge of a breakthrough, and that because that conversation about reallocation of Ukrainian forces is reported to have taken place 2 weeks ago, we may now be seeing some of the results of it. So I'm putting up a few more points. The first of which is, it's a tweet from Defmon. Again, this is the one that links to Zaluzhny's Telegram channel, and it is announcing the capture of Robotin, which had been, the focus of fighting for several weeks. I think when we spoke on Sunday, the reports at that time were that Ukraine had gained a foothold in the north of the city, and now Ukraine has come out and said that it has been liberated. And to that end, if you have a look at the second item in the nest, it's a video that was put out by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense showing fighting into the city and then the liberation of some villagers there. So it's a touching video. And if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to have a look at it, because it shows kind of the reward of freeing people who had been under Russian occupation. The third item back, again, this is speculation from Russian sources, particularly Rybar. It's the tweet by John Helen, and he's talking about reports that, given that Robotin has been captured, the Russians are expecting an attack on Verbov, which is a city or a village that is to the east of Robotin. So that may, given we're hearing accounts of significant activity tonight, it's possible some of it may be in that direction. The fourth item in the nest is a video showing increasing use of artillery systems approaching Tokmak. Any increased deep strikes in that region. And so it does seem like Ukraine is slowly advancing toward Tokmak, which will be a critical city to take because of its position, both proximity to the Sea of Azov, potentially putting Ukrainian artillery systems, MLRS and the like, and Gimlers in range to cut the land bridge, and also because of its significance on logistics lines. Okay, next block of material. These items are some of the numerical summaries that I like to include. So the first item that's going to go up in the nest is a document that was passed along by H.I. Sutton, Covert Shores, that is being taken as a sign of increasing weakness in Russian logistics, particularly in Crimea, where apparently some civilian locations are now being required to report on their stocks of food and fuel. And the suggestion is that there may be increasing shortages or increasing difficulty in restocking food and fuel. And so they feel the need to account for everything that's there. So again, it's anecdotal, but it's indicative of Russian logistical weakness. Second item in the nest is data passed along by our friend Andrew Perpetua. And Andrew, every couple of days, will pass along info on the process of demining in the Kherson region. I believe he said it's either one of the local mayors or the governor, I don't recall which, who will publish figures on the square footage, square area in hectares of land that has been cleared. And so they're saying that they've now surveyed 75,000 hectares, and that in that they had detected and neutralized more than 93,000 explosive objects. And it's unfortunate that there isn't more reporting on this. This is just one region. If you imagine 93,000 objects in just this one region, and then you apply that more broadly across all of Ukraine, it strikes me that the numbers would be almost mind-boggling. It would be, I think, really interesting to get more data on this from other regions. And just as a plug, I mentioned it at the top of the show, but on Sunday, our guest will be Ryan Hendrickson, who goes by the handle Tip of the Spear here on Twitter. And he's involved with some significant demining efforts in Ukraine. And so hopefully we'll raise some of these data points like what Andrew's passed along with Ryan. And we'll maybe try and get some insight into, not just the day-to-day challenges they have, but also whether it's possible to get better insight into the demining process for the whole of the country. The third item back in the nest is another update. So there is our friend Nalcio, who works with Oryx's Losses Project, who does a weekly update on the losses of Ukraine and Russia just in the counteroffensive. He usually puts those out on Fridays, so you'll see that tomorrow. The other person who's doing regular sort of quantitative numbers is Robert Tulp. So you'll see that's the third item in the nest. His numbers are not just for the counteroffensive, though. They're for the entirety of the war, but he compares the loss numbers against the numbers of vehicles that were in service at the beginning of the invasion. And so I highlighted them last week. I won't speak to them at length here, but I'll just put them up for your reference. The next couple of items, so 4th, 5th, and 6th, are going to the trend of increasing Ukrainian attacks against Russian air bases in the last few days. Now, this has been a strategy that Ukraine's pursued for quite a while, but the frequency with which it's happening has really ramped up. And so in the last few days, you'll see that the fourth item back discusses Ukrainian attacks against the Shchikova air base in Russia, where it was claimed that they managed to damage several aircraft. The Ukrainian spokesman, Andrei Yusov, said at least one aircraft had been damaged. Likewise, in the fifth item back in the nest, there was also an attack on the Soltsi air base and that in that particular attack, a drone was claimed to have been used, and that at least one Tu-22 bomber was, in this case, it wound up being clear that it was destroyed. You can see the photographs there in the post from Malachi Brown. There was a claim that Ukraine may have damaged 2 aircraft in total. So this one's destroyed. There may have been another, but I'm not aware of anybody having evidence via satellite or otherwise of damage to another aircraft. However, many of the other bombers at that Soltsi Air Base were sort of immediately moved off to other bases. If another sustained damage but was still capable of flying, it may just have been moved, and therefore the damage couldn't be observed. But in the last few days, Ukrainian spokesman came out and said that they had carried out attacks that had damaged 5 Russian aircraft at air bases. And given there's the claim of 2 at Soltsi, I think they claimed 1 or 2 at Shekova. I'm not sure where their count of the 5th came from. If anybody's paying close attention to those attacks, perhaps mapping them or keeping a list, please let me know, because I'd love to present that kind of work. And when I mentioned that there was a lot of activity going on tonight, I believe one of the claims was that some missiles may have been launched at the Shekova Air Base. So it's interesting that initial reports seem to be that Ukraine is targeting it once again, just a few days later. So that suggests, a real focus of the Ukrainians on Russian aircraft. And obviously the destruction of a Tu-22, they're extremely expensive and quite rare. And so that's quite a loss for Russia. The 6th item back in the nest goes to what was involved in those strikes. And so some people were saying, wow, that air base is a huge distance into Russia. I believe that there were some maps done up that I think it's over 600 kilometers, maybe approaching 700 kilometers. It's amazing if they can get a drone to fly in that far. Interestingly, however, the UK Defense Intelligence, in their daily updates, they put out that they believe some of the UAV attacks, so you'll see it in their 2nd and 3rd bullet points there, some of these UAV attacks are being launched from inside Russian territory, and that copter UAVs are unlikely to have the range to reach the airbase from outside Russia. Now, of course, this is just the UK's assessment, but again, people were surprised at the range implied if drones were used here, and so the possibility that Ukrainian operatives, whether partisans or special forces, may be operating this deep into Russian territory was definitely intriguing. And so at this point, just as an administrative note, I'll remind you guys that I'm running through the news and I kind of develop a theme. I understand that by having all the material ready, I can just keep rolling with it, and I'm happy to do that. I prepare enough to fill the time. But if you guys want to add in any thoughts, questions, or comments, do feel free to come up, and we'll work you into the conversation. You can do that by requesting the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. Because we'd like to get as many people into the conversation as possible, if you're enjoying the conversation, please retweet it out. You can do that with the button that is in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. So this next block of material is flowing from this idea of the strikes on the Russian air bases. And this goes to continued strikes, deep strikes into Russian territory, including toward Moscow. And so this material should be up in the nest now. Yeah, so this is just to point out that it is, well, not a nightly occurrence. Every 2 or 3 nights now, Ukraine is sending drones against Moscow. Some people have noted that even though many of these drones are being intercepted, it continues to have psychological effects. Frequently the Moscow region is now shutting down all of its airports for several hours because of the approaching drones. And many of the downtown workers are now being kept out and working remotely. So, there are several impacts from it. And it doesn't show any sign of stopping as a strategy. If you have a look at the second item in the nest, given how many of these attacks are occurring now, it's hard to report on them all individually. So I'm glad to see that our friend Sam Bendet, who tracks drone matters closely, has started to track them for the Moscow region, including by calendar and on the map, which is a great initiative. Hopefully he keeps that up. Given that there are so many other strikes happening, the majority are targeted at the Moscow region, but there are others happening in other regions of Russia. I don't know whether Sam will expand his tracking of it, or in the event he doesn't, if anybody's aware of an initiative to track these comprehensively, I'm not sure. Does anybody know? Does GeoConfirm track all of these consistently? Maybe somebody can have a look at the GeoConfirm map and get back to us. In any event, we got hands. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I know Live UA Map was tracking all impacts and stuff and detonations and explosions around. I haven't honestly been utilizing Live UA Map as many times, but I can go check that now and see if they are. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's another great suggestion. They've been doing good, consistent work as well. So the third item back I wanted to highlight is looks like a shift in some allies. Given that there have been differing opinions from Western allies on on Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory, there is the consistent reporting that the United States has been clear that its weapon systems are not to be used for strikes into Russian territory, but that Crimea is Ukraine. That seems to be the American position. I believe we've had comments, I think both from Wallace and from Sunak in the UK, that some Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory proper is only logical given the nature of the war. So they're sort of on the we'll call it the opposite end. Interestingly, this third item back is the reporting in an interview between the German foreign minister and Anadolu Agency, which is a Turkish news outlet, during the foreign minister's visit to Turkey. The German foreign minister came out and said that Ukraine drone attacks within Russia are within international law and that Germany would support them, which is, interesting given the ongoing debate in Germany about whether to provide Taurus missiles, and reports that there was some openness to provide them, but that they would be delayed. I believe this was the article in Der Spiegel a little over a week ago. They would be delayed while there was a software update potentially to geofence their ability to strike into Russian territory. So, given the Germans on one hand are potentially delaying the delivery of those systems to limit their use in Russian territory, but at the same time, the German foreign minister is now saying attacks on Russian territory are permissible. It's an interesting shift in tone. And to that end, the fourth item back in the nest is a tweet from Steve Siegel, who is a professor of history, and he talks about having paid very close attention to discussion around escalation and views on the proper offensive activities of the Ukrainians. He thinks it's quite a big deal that Germany has changed its posture here. And so it will be interesting to see whether that has any impact on Germany's decision to take some time in delaying the provision of the Taurus missiles. The next block of items I wanted to talk about are the defection of the crew of a Russian Mi-8 helicopter, which was pretty big news. I'll just pause for a moment and say that it's been a crazy week. So in preparing the materials here, there were some things that happened on Monday that were a big deal that I had completely forgotten about by today. And it was only in preparing for the discussion that, because I had retweeted them, that I was reminded of them. It's amazing how much is happening in 3 and 4 day spans. But anyway. Okay. On the topic of this helicopter, I think that the first news of this broke via Russian mill blogger sites. So the first item up there is a tweet by Dmitry of War Translated, passing along a post from Fighter Bomber, which is generally regarded as fairly reliable on aircraft matters. And they told a fairly long story about how a helicopter got lost, landed in a field, and when they tried to take off again, they were shot at and then therefore captured. But and by the way, in this tweet, Dmitry says this all happened a few weeks ago, but then down thread he realizes that from the phrasing that was mistaken and that it happened much more recently. So they're not talking about any kind of separate incident. It's all the same. But this was immediately, dismissed as being incredible because the airfield in Poltava, I think, is something like more than 100 miles from the Russian border. So it's not clear how you get lost for 100 miles. And it just didn't make sense. And it also comes after several reports of Ukraine having significant initiatives to try to get Russian pilots to surrender their aircraft, right? There were reports maybe 4 or 5 months ago where Ukraine had been in touch with several pilots, including, I think, of Tu-22 bombers, but several fighter pilots as well, in an effort to get them to essentially defect with their aircraft. But that what happened was the FSB became aware of the initiative, and there was sort of a cat and mouse game to try to get info from one another, and ultimately none were turned over. But this sounds like perhaps in that, the same initiative, and this time it worked. So the second tweet back there is from Michael Weiss, and he's noting that he has a folder full of messages that he's received from sources back and forth between Ukrainians and Russian pilots trying to set up their defection. And they had been planning how, if only one wants to defect, if only the pilot wants to defect, what do they do with the crew? And there was talk about potentially drugging them or, winning them over. Ultimately, what happened is that Budinov, in an interview, had said that the pilot had been recruited, but that other crew members, when they realized what were happening, tried to resist and were killed. So that's how that situation worked itself out. So anyway, it's a fascinating story. I wanted to highlight one bit of good OSINT work that happened in connection with it. If you have a look at the third item in the nest, the tweet from Ukraine Weapons Tracker. So often for the different units, they'll have aircraft denoted by number and by color. And usually those are fairly unique. So in this case, the helicopter was 62 red. But it turns out that there were 2 different 62 reds in this case, and that the account of Mike Yeo, who is quote tweeted there, matched up the camo patterns at certain specific spots on the helicopter, and that they can also be referred to by airframe number, which isn't always visible in various photographs. But by matching the camo up from past photographs, where they have their inventory, that like OSINT observers have inventories showing all the airframe numbers, they figured out the right one. So I thought that was pretty cool, and just an opportunity to mention there's a distinction between, I think they call them BORT numbers for like 64 red or 62 red, and their actual airframe numbers. A moment ago, John, I saw your hand up. Did you want to come in with anything?
Oh no, I was just gonna mention that bloody photo of some of the jet fighter parts. And people originally, when they had said, they came over without a fight, and the people kept reposting this photo like, well, why is there blood all over this box? Which obviously, and then I was unaware actually that they came out and admitted that some of the crew had resisted, because it kind of alludes to your point before, right, of how so much is going on in the past couple of days that these big news kind of got overshadowed as well. But
yeah, it's incredible. I mean, we had the destruction of a Tu-22. We had this defection of the helicopter. There was also this landing of Ukrainian forces on Crimea today. All of which are huge news, but a ton of it is just being swamped because of the death of Prigozhin. So there's so much going on. Last 2 points in the offensive generally. And this goes to sort of the philosophy of OSINT and good management of info. So if you have a look, they're the 4th and 5th items back. So the 4th item back is a tweet from our friend Constantine, who is calling out a set of tweets by an account called, I believe it's called TV Toronto. And what happened is, I believe the unit is the 82nd Airborne in Ukraine that has the majority of modern Western weapon systems, in particular Strikers. And I believe they may also have Martyrs. And about a week ago, video started to come out of some Strikers being destroyed in combat by Russian drones. And the footage, it was filmed by the Russians. So the Russians had the video, they were releasing it. And then some open source accounts, some sort of military tracker accounts, took that video and said, well, look, here is this equipment that was widely publicized as going to this specific unit. Now we're seeing it destroyed. This unit hasn't previously been engaged in the fighting. It looks like they may be moving toward the front now. Then a Ukrainian deputy minister of defense, Hanna Maliar, came out and noted that they were attacked. And this account, TV Toronto, put out a tweet short thread, that said, this unit was caught on video. They were attacked. Here are some OSINT accounts on Twitter that shared the video that the Russians put up. Therefore, these OSINT accounts are likely responsible for twigging the Russians or highlighting to the Russians the location of these units that resulted in further attacks against them. And so our friend Constantine is disagreeing with this whole set of arguments, saying if the Russians are carrying out the attacks, they have the video. It was widely published that this unit had these specific vehicle types. Everybody knows that. The Russians surely know where this unit is located better than a brief tweet on Twitter would reveal to them. And that it's unfair to pick a particular OSINT account. In this case, by the way, they picked Rob Lee, who has been a very dedicated supporter of Ukraine. He's traveled to Ukraine several times with Michael Kaufman and others. It's kind of unfair to pick him and suggest that his resharing of Russian video would, put that unit at risk. And so I'm highlighting this to say, yes, the Ukrainians would like you to not share information about the location of units. I fully support that. That's also why I don't tend to share a lot of video in these talks about units. However, there's the individual case-specific relevance of, do the Russians have the footage? It's a different thing if it came from a cell phone, from a civilian, whether in occupied territory or from, equipment in transit, or if, say, a Ukrainian soldier released it unofficially. Those are different stories. So it's just to be mindful. Number one, be careful. There are real-world implications for the things you share. But at the same time, there's no need to be overly policing of these items, particularly in circumstances where it's clear it's already known. What this did, though, was set up the fifth item in the nest. I got into a longish conversation with an account in the replies, D. Mojovensis, who does good geolocation work as well. And he was pointing out that it may be illegal, literally illegal under Ukrainian law, to share these things even for foreigners. And he and I had a little bit of a back and forth, and I read the Ukrainian law and noted that generally Ukrainian law only applies to events that happen in Ukraine unless they're particularly significant crimes that are like designated as grave crimes. In which case, sometimes events that happen outside Ukraine can also lead to criminal charges. And in this case, it's interesting because the way the law is drafted says that if you share information on the movement of vehicles or weaponry, it's like a normal crime, a minor crime. So in theory, Ukrainian law would only apply to actions taken in Ukraine for the sharing of that information. However, if you share information about the movement of units that puts them at risk, that falls into the grave crime category. So in theory, if you do that even outside Ukraine, Ukraine might assert that you're criminally liable. Unresolved in our discussion between D. Mojovensis and I was the definition of dissemination and whether it sharing something on social media in a foreign country to a server on that exists in a foreign country would qualify as activity taking place in Ukraine. And the law is not drafted clearly enough to know about that. And then we also covered some other interesting points, like there's a question of legal insignificance, as in this case with Rob Lee, where the video already came from the Russians. It's likely Ukraine would not pursue the matter because the information shared was not significant to knowledge of the location of the unit. And then finally, the particular tweet that I highlighted up here that D. Mojovensis passed along. So he shared with me, for example, a legal opinion interpreting that law, which was quite informative, and I can pass that along to people if they're interested. And then he also shared this directive from the Ukrainian General Staff on what information not to share. So I'm passing it along to you guys so that you can have these documents in front of you to consider them. And I mentioned the legal aspects not to try to work around them, but just to understand what the expectations literally are. And it seems like it's not fully specified. So, I'll just fall back on the moral argument of be very mindful what you share. If it's not serving, an important purpose, then if it hasn't been shared by the Ukrainian General Staff, it's probably not worth sharing. But I don't think it also makes sense to be calling out longtime supporters of Ukraine like Rob Lee. Anyway, that was my background on the matter because I spent a fair while reading Ukrainian law and going back and forth with him on this point. I did notice after the fact that when you go up the chain in the replies, Mojovensis may have deleted one of his tweets, which I think may break the chain and make it a little bit harder to navigate. But anyway, check it out if you're interested. If you want that legal opinion or any of these other documents like the General Staff Directive, let me know. I'll pass them along. So in the order of the agenda, I think I'm going to run another, say, 15 or 20 minutes. In the order of the agenda, I had some material on the Black Sea, including the landing on Crimea. I believe that Exit, she was briefly in the audience, but I know that Exit had been traveling today. And given her expertise on the Black Sea, I think what I'll do, because there's a fair bit to talk about there, I'll save that material for Sunday. I'm going to jump ahead and just chat about some developments in terms of Ukrainian equipment, because there were some big changes in the last few days. And I'll do that for the last 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will wrap up. If you'll just bear with me, I just have to scroll to the right location here. So the first set of material will be on developments with regard to F-16s, because there's quite a lot that's happened there. The first of which is that the United States went pretty rapidly through a process of first saying, well, you know what, we are now open to potentially training Ukrainians on flying F-16s. I believe that statement came out yesterday. And then today they came out and said that they intend to train Ukrainians on F-16s, both pilots and maintenance staff. And I believe that came up in the Pentagon press conference that was held this afternoon. And then I saw that Colby, in live tweeting that, also noted that this decision to train Ukrainians on F-16s is a proactive move. Apparently, it was announced that there was concern that there may be a limitation on the ability to train in European countries, and therefore the United States wanted to get the process running earlier. So I don't know, since you listened to it firsthand, Colby, was there anything you wanted to add that came out of that press conference?
Yeah, I think that's about sums it up. I would just reiterate that although this was not offered up in the initial announcement, the press was actually asking relatively good questions today about the F-16, which is a welcome change because usually they ask very bad questions about everything. But a number of good questions were asked, and one of the questions elicited the answer that this decision was made proactively, as you say, with the expectation that training capacity in Europe may not be sufficient to train all of the pilots that Ukraine wants to train. And initially the United States was saying that if that situation arose, then they would be willing to look at training some of these pilots in the United States. And now they're saying we just decided to start that anyway, with the expectation that it likely would probably be the case that Ukraine's going to want to train more pilots than the European partners who were supposedly going to be taking the lead on this, just don't have enough infrastructure or capacity to train all of these air crews because they themselves do not have particularly large air forces. So they can't take on that many students. And I viewed that as quite significant, perhaps even more significant than the decision to train the Ukrainians in the United States itself, because it speaks to a change in thinking, or at least a potential change in thinking in the Pentagon and perhaps even the White House about how they're approaching this war, because the approach thus far has been 100% reactionary. There's been virtually nothing that has been done proactively by the United States. So if that's changing, I view that as very significant.
Gene, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to mention one thing. This, again, may be connected with the departure of Colin Cowell. Things have changed substantially in the thought process at DOD and within the administration on this since he left. And he was so against this and apparently had convinced the SecDef that was the wise position. But as you said, now that the thinking has changed and changed rapidly. And as you said, because of the European allies, I think they realized the only way to get things up and running was to get them at least English trained in September. And then I think the operations are supposed to begin in October, if I'm not right. Is that right, Colby? They're training them at an air guard base and at Lackland, something on that order was my reminiscence from today. But yeah, I think this is just a very large change, and I think it was a sea change that was coming in policy. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. If anything was incorrect there, Colby can jump in, but those details sounded pretty close to me in terms of timeline and location for training. It's interesting that the U.S. should be concerned about training capacity on F-16s for European allies, because there have been several new announcements about training programs in Europe in the last few days. So, and those are up in the nest. The second item is Zelensky announcing that Portugal will be training F-16 pilots. And the third item back is Zelensky noting that Greece will be training F-16 pilots. And then the fourth is that pilot training has actually begun in Denmark, and that a total of 70 Ukrainian servicemen are being trained, but that I think that's a combination of, I think the numbers I saw were something like 8 pilots and 65 ground staff. And so it's just odd that as between Denmark ongoing, now Portugal plus Greece, that the U.S. feels like they need even more. If anything, I read that as being very promising about the anticipated number of airframes that they'll receive, which is still, quite up in the air. In that, if I remember correctly, 19 were promised, and then the Netherlands said they would provide F-16s as well. The number, Zelensky came out and said they had 42 available, but then, official sources said the number would probably be something below 42. So, that's talking about, something in the ballpark of maybe 50 to 60 airframes, which is a good first start. But interestingly, we've had a few additional announcements since then. So the fifth item back in the nest was there were rumors going around for the last 2 or 3 days that Norway would be providing F-16s as well. And the Norwegian Prime Minister finally confirmed that just earlier today. So that confirmation is great. The number that was being circulated was that Norway may provide 12 airframes. And I think that's partly because Norway, in retiring those F-16s, were selling several of them to Romania, and then a smaller number were being sold to the company Draken. And apparently the Draken contract was canceled. The number under that contract, if I remember correctly, was 12. So that's partly where the number 12 came from. However, if you look at the fifth item in the nest, tweet from the Lookout, he's passing along in Norwegian newspapers the speculation that the number to be provided to Ukraine will be less than 12, and the number being floated is 5 to 10. Now, I'm not sure why that is, whether the Draken contract might be re-signed for a smaller number, or the airworthiness of it. They may have been sufficient to sell to Draken, but perhaps they're not in a condition to be made available to Ukraine for combat purposes. I'm not sure why that is. But if any of you have read the Norwegian coverage, feel free to come up and add some details in here. In addition to the F-16s, there were developments on a couple of other airframes as well, including Gripen and F-18s. So I'll put those materials up in the nest. So the news today on Gripens was in several Swedish news outlets reported that the leader of the opposition had come out and made it clear that their intention would be to provide Gripen fighters to Ukraine after Sweden is admitted to NATO. But the Swedish Prime Minister had come out, I think, 1 to 2 weeks ago and said Gripens would not be provided. So it remains to be seen whether this opposition pressure might change the government's mind at all. If I'm not mistaken, I think Sweden recently had an election. Somebody can correct me there. So I don't think there's any prospect of the opposition sweeping into power and changing policy anytime soon. But anyway, interesting that there is some political pressure from the opposition. The reason F-18s are relevant, second item in the nest, President Zelensky was meeting with the Finnish Prime Minister, and after that meeting, in a press conference, somebody asked Zelensky what his thoughts were on the F-18s that Finland is retiring. And I believe Zelensky's response was something like, we will take whatever we can get. That would be, terrific. We could use any aircraft. But I don't think there's any movement on that front. I only pass it.
Oh, Michael, your microphone's getting a little bit fuzzy. Sorry. I just thought I'd save it from getting to the point where it stops. Just a reminder again that I really like a clean nest, so any of the items you might be looking for will be that have been shared in the nest will be in the replies to the space. And don't forget, you can always request to come up and speak by hitting the mic button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And if you'd like to let your friends know that we're having this chat, at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is the little chat bubble, which will take you to the tweet for the space, which will allow you to retweet it out if you haven't already. And if you have already and you want to let people know again, you can undo the tweet and retweet it.
Planet, thanks very much for covering for me. Sorry about that, guys. Obviously, that's going to be the last time it's happened. That the reset will be required in the space. We're going to wrap up in maybe 10 minutes. I'll just put a couple more items up about equipment, and then we'll call it. I appreciate you hanging in with me. In case you don't appreciate it, I put a lot of time into preparing the material, and when we don't get through it, I feel like it's a missed opportunity. So I'll just put the last few items. So we spoke about the Gripen, we spoke about the F-18. Sorry, I'm just checking to see what the status of the nest is. Yeah, so the third item back in the nest is, again, so by the way, for those of you who haven't been around much, Colby does a great job tracking procurement and provision of military aid to Ukraine. So a lot of the stuff that comes out, he breaks first. So I use a lot of his tweets in the nest. This third item back was news just today from Finland's public broadcaster that Finland is exploring the possibility to set up a production line for Patriot armored vehicles in Ukraine, and that Poland already has a licensed production agreement. And so, that's kind of in keeping with several other manufacturers, Rheinmetall and others. And then the recent discussions with, was it Sweden? They discussed the possible domestic production of CV90s. So it seems like Ukraine is working to get access to the right to manufacture a fair variety of armored vehicles domestically. And so the Patria would be the latest on that list. I'm not particularly familiar with the Patria. Colby, do you know, is it a particularly capable system?
Yeah, sorry. Patria is not a specific system. It's a domestic Finnish producer of armored vehicles. So they have a few different models, and some of those have already been donated by the Finnish army to the Ukrainian army. I don't think they have any tracked vehicles. No, actually, I think they do. But a lot of them are wheeled. So, in the picture that's used in the article, you can see one of their facilities, and there's a 4x4 wheeled infantry fighting vehicle out front. And the Ukraine has, I forget exactly which model, but Ukraine has some already from Finland that were donated a while ago. I think they've had them since close to earlier in the war. So they've been in use for a while. And I don't know exactly, the article doesn't specify what models they might be looking at producing in Ukraine, but they're exploring the possibility.
Thanks for that. I was just putting the last items up in the nest that we'll cover tonight. So anyway, it would be great if those variety of Patriot vehicles help out Ukraine. So before getting into the last items, just a reminder that our next conversation will be on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And as a promo, that we'll be chatting with Ryan Hendrickson, who goes by Tip of the Spear here on Twitter. And he works, intensively with teams that engage in demining in Ukraine. So that will be the focus of our interview with him. And then we had saved some of the Black Sea developments. So hopefully we'll get into those a little bit on Sunday, and then we'll jump into the general updates. And just a reminder, I said it at the top of the space, but if you're new here, we do live stream these conversations to YouTube. So if you miss the conversation here, or it's just easier for you to listen, perhaps while driving, or doing chores, whatever, check out that YouTube account where the copies of our live stream are kept. Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 quick blocks of updates on equipment. I'm only going to speak to the items in them because they're more or less just flagging you to, hey, there is a development here, without a ton of detail that I think we can get into. So I'm working from the 3rd item in the nest, and I'll note that there was an update on the manufacturing levels of artillery ammunition from a French company, Nexter. And again, this is a tweet initially caught by Colby, where Nexter has been producing between 1,000 and 2,000 rounds, I believe, per month. And the latest report is that they're going to increase that production rate by 3 times. So it's not clear whether that's an increase to closer to 3,000 per month or closer to 6,000 per month. But in any event, an 3 times production increase, is important. That follows the fairly rapid ramp up of the U.S., which, when we spoke about it most recently, John Ridge mentioned the U.S. should now be producing well over 28,000 rounds per month. And then in our last session, we also covered the fact that the UK is projecting to ramp up its manufacturing by a factor of something like 8 times. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. France was delivering Ukraine 1,000 rounds per month, and they were doubling that, and now they're saying that the goal is to triple that. I don't know whether that's 1,111 or 2,000, but production is definitely somewhat higher. But it was those figures were for the amount of shells that were being delivered by France on a monthly basis, not the total production from Nexter.
Great, thanks for correcting me there. Okay, next item. There was a little bit of confusion that came from a Forbes article talking about if Ukraine is getting the airframes it needs in the F-16, that now it should get better cruise missiles. And apparently there's a quote in there about joint air-to-surface strike missiles, or JASSMs, are still on Kiev's wish list. But a couple of accounts, Colby included, came out and said, wait, where has Ukraine ever asked for this? And I think there was a bit of a back and forth in the replies, with the conclusion being that Ukraine may have made the request privately. It's not clear that they've included it in an official request to the United States. I do know it's a munition that Colby and John Ridge and others have highlighted because existing precision guided munitions numbers are limited, with regard to Scalp and Storm Shadow and so on, that something like JASM will need to be provided if fighting goes on for quite a long time, and that perhaps planning to increase capacity to permit that should begin soon. And so this is, sort of just more of the same, with the exception that there was a bit of confusion about whether Ukraine had actually requested it yet. The third item down in that tweet was today we got the first picture of the JDAM, which is the Joint Direct Attack Munition, ER, right? So these are guidance kits that are put onto, essentially dumb bombs. Hopefully I'm saying that roughly correctly, in order to allow them some maneuver in the air, and that the ER is the extended range version. And this was apparently the first time they were seen. I believe that JDAMs several times have been seen as used in combat by the Ukrainians, but it wasn't clear to me whether this is the first time they've seen the ER model or whether this is the first time it was deployed on an Su-27. But we've been joined by our experts, so we'll go to Colby.
Oh, I see John came up as well, so if he wants to field this one, he can go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So the JDAM ER wing kits, I believe the Ukrainians have specifically received the, I need to look up the number. It's the wing kit itself is called here it is. Yeah. So they received I believe the GBU 62B, which is the designation for a Mark 82 500-pound general purpose bomb with a JDAM kit attached to it and a BSU 104 wing kit attached to it. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe these wing kits were potentially diverted from an existing U.S. order for wing kits to be used in some trials with Quick Strike ER. Quick Strike is kind of like JDAM, but instead of turning it into a GPS-guided munition, it turns a Mark 80 series general purpose bomb into a naval mine. Quick Strike ER is that, but with the wing kit. Currently, prior to this, neither the U.S. Air Force or the U.S. Navy operated JDAM ER. The only operational user was the Royal Australian Air Force. The technology was originally developed by an Australian company, and then Boeing bought the IP rights to it and incorporated it into JDAM and basically sold it back to the Australians, and is now offering it for a variety of U.S. applications.
Well, thanks for that history. And do you have any idea, given that history, would the ER kits be available in significant supply, or will they be a fairly limited item?
My understanding is it's probably fairly limited. Because although the Royal Australian Air Force didn't operate some, although they did operate some, they had some in inventory, I don't think the number was particularly large. And I also don't know when exactly they were delivered. So if they were delivered quite a while ago, the line have been effectively dormant. For example, Boeing currently only has the wing kits for the 500-pound bombs, the Mark 82s in production. They haven't even finished development of the wing kit for the Mark 84, which is the 2,000-pound member of the Mark 80 series.
Thanks for the detail again. Okay, last point in that block. Again, I'm working from the fourth item back in the nest, or excuse me, the third item back in the nest. The last item down there's a video that came out today that appeared to show Ukrainians dismantling D-Pick'em artillery shells in order to take out the submunitions to use them as drone drop grenades. I heard some criticism of this, saying there's a lot of value in the munitions being packed in the artillery shell, and that if they can be fired at great range, then they may be more effective than individually dropped. Like, is the availability of grenades or other potentially drone drop munitions so low that they need to be dismantling these cluster munitions that are so effective? It begs some questions. But go ahead, John.
So this is actually something they've been requesting formally for a while. They specifically wanted the submunitions. I can't remember the designation for them, but they wanted the submunitions from the Rockeye, which is a unguided cluster munition in U.S. inventory. Unlike DPICM, it is purely meant for anti-armor. It's not really optimized to create anti-personnel effects. It's just a big shape-charged submunition. They wanted some of those bombs to cut them open and then use the submunitions to be dropped from UAVs. That request was never granted, as far as I'm aware. In terms of using the M42 and M44 submunitions from DPICM rounds, broadly speaking, my understanding is that in terms of kind of sustainment of these drone drop munitions, it's a bit of a mess because, unfortunately, the Ukrainian MOD, as far as I'm aware, has not really taken any steps to ensure a relatively reliable supply of a few common types of munitions. A lot of these units are basically just scavenging whatever they can for themselves. This is a microcosm of larger things in terms of Ukrainian sustainment, but it is very much kind of an improvised thing being implemented by, I guess, at least a couple of these units who obviously have need of munitions to be dropped from UAVs.
They must be quite short of other options if they're going with those, which is interesting. I had heard the request for the other style of munition that, on the theory they may be disassembled, but it's just it's interesting to see they're doing it with these. I suspect it was always bound to happen. I'll point out that this is an anecdotal video, so we don't know how widespread this is, but it's more an item to keep an eye on, I suspect.
One thing, if I may, Michael, just because my OCD, it's not DPICMs, it's just DPICM. DPICMs is a Kaufmanism. That's not correct.
Oh, okay. So, all right, I'll try and keep it singular in that case. Okay. Last couple of items. These are probably pretty fast. The fourth item back in the nest, as a group. The first is that the Ukrainians now have a new drone. It's called the Perrin, and apparently it very closely resembles the Russian Lancet. We've had reports that the Lancet is one of the more significant threats to Ukraine on the battlefield. And so I suppose one of the greatest forms of flattery is imitation, right? And interestingly, there was a photo of Zelensky visiting some troops. I can't recall where, nearest the front, somebody might remember. And in the background, some people noted, oh, is that like a captured Lancet on display in the background? And now it's seeming more likely that what was captured in the background of the photo was one of these new Perrin drones. And so there were some details in Sam Bendet's thread there. We also got a few more details on the new Ukrainian underwater drone, which is called the Marichka. There were some photos that went around a while ago of this. And so included in that tweet are two items, one being an article put together on H.I. Sutton's website with more details on it. So if you want sort of a breakdown of known features and sort of informed speculation about others, check out Covert Shore's coverage of it. But then the other is the tweet by Archer Abel, which includes video of the testing of the drone, which is, sort of interesting on its own. Without getting into all the details, which you can look up on Covert Shore's website, but it's reported that it has a range of over 1,000 kilometers. And can perform both strike and reconnaissance missions. And then in last item in this block was, interestingly, the 2 patrol boats were delivered to the Ukrainian Coast Guard. And you'll see they're in a tweet from York. For those of you who don't know, York is the ship tracker in the Bosporus, who does a super consistent job. His work is, I would almost say, invaluable in actually getting eyes on. These 2 patrol boats were brought in on a cargo vessel. Given that they're going to the Ukrainian Coast Guard, or excuse me, the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service, it's interesting that they were even permitted by Turkey to pass through the straits, because you would expect that the Border Guard Service would be an arm of the armed forces, and supply of equipment to them in the form of vehicles would be prohibited. Maybe that suggests there's an opening to do things like bring the new minesweepers that were given by the United Kingdom to Ukraine into the Black Sea. If Turkey's open to this, like, it creates a little bit more window for speculation into what's possible. Okay, last block, 5th item back in the nest. And most of this is just report on ongoing aid to Ukraine. The first item I'll highlight to you, it's a tweet by the Kiev Independent. About a week ago, we discussed how Zelensky replaced all of the heads of all of the draft offices in Ukraine. And he wanted them to be replaced with military veterans, because he wanted the people running the drafts to understand the importance of the process to those going into the military, and to understand the importance of it to the country. That was how it was presented. Simultaneously, there were reports of several systems of draft evasion that took various forms, including fake medical certificates and just accepting bribes, to avoid drafting people in. And so this week, the Kiev Independent is reporting on a wide series of raids on these draft offices, which would obviously be targeting, while the heads were all dismissed, these would be the regular staff of the offices. It's not clear what they uncovered, how widespread the problems were. Whenever I cover these items of corruption, it's not so much to highlight the scale of it as how much work is clearly being put into trying to root it out, which honestly is quite impressive, given the other demands on the country. But obviously, it's a critical function. And then the bulk of that tweet is just filled out with various reports of new aid packages. I don't want these to get entirely lost in the shuffle, but I'll admit that the steady flow of aid, it's great. It's so consistent that it can be hard to keep track of it all, especially as some of these smaller countries are just regularly making announcement of small numbers of equipment, in the low tens of millions. But included here are announcements regarding aid from Lithuania, Finland, and Bulgaria. And I know that even just in the last 3 or 4 days, there were also announcements of aid from the Czech Republic and Germany. And then, 4 or 5 countries just in the last few days announcing new equipment, which is terrific news. So the links are there if you'd like to dig into it more deeply. I think with that, we're sort of half an hour over scheduled time, so I'll wrap it up. We'll save the Black Sea material for Sunday, and we'll also get into our interview with Ryan Hendrickson on demining in Ukraine. So with that, I'll thank you all for coming to join us to listen tonight. I'd like to thank all my speakers. The regulars all showed up, and I'd encourage you guys, if you are unfamiliar with them, check out the accounts of the speakers. They have been doing hard work basically for the entirety of the war, and consider giving them a follow. And I'd like to thank my co-hosts, both Planet Baroque and Radio and Nukes. Without your guys' help, it would be very hard to hold these spaces. And so with that, I hope that I'll see you on Sunday for our interesting interview. And otherwise, have a great night.
Crunchy for you and melty for you. You pick two and get more at Panera.